Ladies and gentlemen, to begin at the beginning in one's approach to political economy and to the evaluation of various social systems, one must begin by identifying man's nature. That is, those essential characteristics which distinguish him from all other living species. Man's essential characteristic is his rational faculty. Man's mind is his basic means of survival, his only means of gaining knowledge. Man cannot provide for his simplest physical needs without a process of thought. He needs a process of thought to discover how to plant and grow his food or how to make weapons for hunting. He needs a process of thought to discover how to light a fire, how to weave cloth, how to forge tools, how to make a will, how to make an airplane, how to perform an appendectomy, how to produce an electric light or an electronic tube or a cyclotron or a box of matches. Yet his life depends on such knowledge, and only a volitional act of his consciousness, a process of thought, can provide it.
You have all this money printing, when you have all this debt, you get high inflation. And in fact, the other thing that's happening now is the de-dollarization. And this is another reason that inflation is going to be so much higher. Because one of the other ways the Fed got lucky and we had such low inflation numbers was because of the dollar's reserve status. Because so many of the dollars the Fed was creating were exported and they were hoarded by our trading partners in financial assets. They went into bonds, they went into stocks. So they didn't buy consumer goods. So we had a lot more money, but it wasn't chasing goods. It was chasing financial assets. And that's another reason that stocks did well and bonds did well, because the inflation that we created was used to buy those assets instead of consumer goods. Well, all that is changing and will change as the world de-dollarizes and moves away from the US dollar. So they're not going to need dollars to buy these financial assets. So those prices are going to be coming down, but the prices of goods, the stuff they're going to buy instead, right, that stuff is going to go way up. Which also brings me to the other data point that came out on Thursday, I think it was, that again gets zero coverage. I don't think anybody even talks about it anymore. And that was the trade deficit, this time for the month of March. And the trade deficit wasn't much worse than expected. I mean, it was worse. I mean, just like the jobs numbers are pretty much always better than expected, the trade deficits are almost always worse. I mean, every once in a while you get one that's lower, but they're pretty much always worse than expected. And even if they're lower than expected, they're still horrific. It's not like they're ever good. It's always a huge negative number. And so for March, they were looking for $63.7 billion deficit. And instead they got 64.2, so a bigger deficit. And in fact, the prior month was notched up just a tenth, but the prior month was a bigger number. It was 70.6 billion. So we did get a reduction in the trade deficit for the month, but it's still an enormous number. And that again is showing you that Americans are continuing to spend, because that's the American spending that is driving those trade deficits, because we're spending money on imports and we see that in the trade deficit. If the Fed really was going to be effective at reducing the inflation rate, you would need to see these trade deficits coming way down, because Americans would have to be responding to the Fed's monetary tightening by spending less. And if we were spending less, well, the trade deficits would be a lot lower. But the fact that we're still running these horrific trade deficits, again, shows that the government is not making any progress. And of course, it's not just the Fed, rather, the government itself, because the government continues to spend money. The in excess of $2 trillion budget deficits continue. Those budget deficits represents additional spending, because people who get that money from the government, they're going out and spending it. They're buying all these imported products, right? That's what happens with the budget deficits. This is money that the US government is sending out to Americans that they didn't collect from Americans in taxes. And so there's a big deficit. But what are all these Americans doing with all this money? Well, they're buying stuff with it, right? And so you can see that in the trade deficit. But as long as everybody is spending, we're not going to have a reduction in CPI. Prices are going to keep on rising as a result of all that spending.
A process of thought is an enormously complex process of identification and integration, which only an individual mind can perform. There is no such thing as a collective brain. Man can learn from one another, but learning requires a process of thought on the part of every individual student. Man can cooperate in the discovery of new knowledge, but such cooperation requires the independent exercise of his rational faculty by every individual scientist. Man is the only living species that can transmit and expand his store of knowledge from generation to generation. But such transmission requires a process of thought on the part of the individual recipients. As witness the breakdowns of civilization, the dark ages in the history of mankind's progress, when the accumulated knowledge of centuries vanished from the lives of men who were unable, unwilling, or forbidden to think.
All right, the next one here. Australia's Prime Minister is frustrated that the US won't drop charges against Assange. So Australia Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has expressed frustration over the Biden administration's efforts to convict WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who's an Australian citizen, which a lot of people forget. The US is trying to lock him away, even though he's not American. So Albanese said, quote, "There is nothing to be served by his ongoing incarceration," end quote. And he noted that Assange had already spent a lot of time incarcerated, as he had been held in London's Belmarsh prison since April 2019. And he's been confined to the Ecuadorian embassy. Before that, he was stuck in the Ecuadorian embassy. So Albanese said, quote, "I just say that enough is enough. I know it's frustrating. I share the frustration. I can't do more than make very clear what my position is. And the U.S. administration is certainly very aware of what the Australian government's position is," end quote. Last November, Albanese said he personally asked the U.S. government to drop their charges against Assange, who is facing up to 175 years in prison if convicted for publishing information that revealed U.S. war crimes. That's really his crime, is that he embarrassed the U.S., published things they don't want. And if he is convicted and put away, it's going to set a precedent that the U.S. government could, convict, charge other publishers like the New York Times, any media outlet, for publishing information that they don't want out there. That's how, serious this is. So Taiwanese Defense Minister Xu Kuo-cheng said on Monday that Taiwan is in talks with the Pentagon on the U.S. providing a $500 million weapons package that would come at no cost to Taipei. So he said this in comments to Taiwan's legislature. He said, quote, "These extra weapons will be given to us for free and will not be deducted from the purchase list, which has been delayed by the U.S., end quote.
In order to sustain his life, every living species has to follow a certain course of action required by its nature. The action required to sustain human life is primarily intellectual. Everything man needs has to be discovered by his mind and produced by his effort. Production is the application of reason to the problem of survival. If some men do not choose to think, they can survive only by imitating and repeating a routine of work discovered by others. But those others had to discover it, or none would have survived. If some men do not choose to think or to work, they can survive temporarily only by looting the goods produced by others. But those others had to produce them, or none would have survived. Regardless of what choice is made in this issue by any man or by any number of men, regardless of what blind, irrational, or evil course they may choose to pursue, the fact remains that reason is man's means of survival, and that men prosper or fail, survive or perish, in proportion to the degree of their rationality.
The American government understand that the spring offensive either is not going to happen or will be a paltry and symbolic only, or will be a miserable, crushing, catastrophic defeat for Ukraine.
So you have to understand, Judge, and I think you hear this from other folks, our government is torn on this. There's no monolithic or unified voice on this. You have the neocons, Victoria Nuland, Tony Blinken, who want the war. They want to continue this. I don't think that they would do anything. I think if their mother signed up to be on the Ukrainian side and they knew they would lose, they'd still send their mother into battle. I don't think they care. I think they want the conflict. I think they feel that, to use a communist term, the ends justify the means, and so that's what they're trying to do here. They think that weakening Russia, no matter what it takes, even if it means sacrificing the Ukrainians, is worth it. So I don't think that they're pushing for it. I think others within the White House, within the Pentagon, are starting to recognize that the current configuration and weapons available plus troop strength does not equate to a potential victory by Ukraine over Russia.
Since knowledge, thinking, and rational actions are properties of the individual, since the choice to exercise his rational faculty or not depends on the individual, man's survival requires that those who think be free of the interference of those who don't. Since men are neither omniscient nor infallible, they must be free to agree or disagree, to cooperate or to pursue their own independent course, each according to his own rational judgment. Freedom is the fundamental requirement of man's mind.
And here is what Dr. Kalmar said. It's not just what's happening in Iran or in Russia that we should worry about, although it should worry us a lot. It's also what's happening here in the U.S., Kalmar said. Who's imprisoning Julián Assange? Who's creating more laws to curtail the freedom to protest? All of those indicators and trends are occurring within the so-called democracies of the world. So that's a good point. It's very obvious, very out there. We hold all of these free press, free democracy, and in the meantime, we're suppressing a journalist.
And I think this is another sign of the weakening of our empire, which we don't cry over, because they're willing to speak out against us. And there's been other countries asking the questions. And I think it's becoming very clear that without the United States support for the punishment of Assange, it wouldn't be happening. You know, I keep thinking it's such a stress to punish somebody by breaking one of our laws. He doesn't even happen to be a U.S. citizen.
Yeah. And so Adam writes that it's a big step toward the U.S. government going to war in Mexico. Again, you say, that's crazy. But as Adam points out, Section 123 of the 213-page long bill says that, quote, not later than 60 days after the date of the enactment of this act, the Secretary of Homeland Security, in coordination with the Secretary of State, shall submit to the appropriate congressional committees a report on whether a Mexican drug cartel, described in paragraph 2, meets the 10 criteria for designation as a foreign terrorist organization, end quote. And the bill referenced 11 different, quote, Mexican drug cartels.
Yes. I think there is a libertarian position. Briefly, I won't speak for all libertarians, but suggesting, a different approach. And one of them would be to, make drugs legal, like they did marijuana. You say, what? How can you do that? Well, I remember the time I was in a debate and they were accusing me of legalizing morphine and heroin. But nobody said, oh yeah, if it's legal, I'd probably be tempted to use it. This whole thing. So, no, it is dangerous, but we can't expect the government to protect us against all kinds of problems, because I might be able to find a few things in our diet that may be killing more people than all the drugs.
Security, or to designate these groups in Mexico as terrorist organizations, because that would open them up to being targets in the war on terrorism. Yeah. It would be no different than ISIS or Al-Qaeda. So the idea that Mexico is going to sit by, in Obrador, the president of Mexico already said, we're not going to permit any foreign government to intervene in our territory, much less that a government's armed forces intervene. So forget it, it's out of the question, you can't come over. So if we call them terrorists, they're legally terrorists, then they're going to be part of the war on terror, and we're going to be bombing Mexico.
Oh.
John Bolton may be happy, but we're not going to be that awfully happy.
One mistake always leads to two problems, and that's what we have done in our foreign policy. When you think about it, I bet you we would have spent a lot less money since World War II if we had not had this continuation, expansive foreign policy where we felt like we had to be the world policeman. Yeah. And even I think Bush used to say we shouldn't be the world policeman. He knew the right words, but they had no intention of doing that. The whole thing is it's designed for us to be the world policeman.
A rational mind does not work under compulsion. It does not subordinate its grasp of reality to anyone's orders, directives, or controls. It does not sacrifice its knowledge, its view of the truth, to anyone's opinions, threats, wishes, plans, or welfare. Such a mind may be hampered by others. It may be silenced, proscribed, imprisoned, or destroyed. It cannot be forced. A gun is not an argument.
Well, your major thesis throughout is kind of that politics has dropped its pretenses, that there is no longer, not that it ever actually was what politics claims to be, but that it's not even pretending anymore. Is that accurate?
Yes, but that's a big shift.
Yeah.
The idea that they don't pretend anymore. You could go talk to your grandparents. I've told this to Tom Woods, and they can certainly recall when you might go into someone's home and they would have a portrait of JFK on the wall. If you go to Turkey today, there are portraits of Ataturk everywhere. I mean, people revere him. He's sort of the FDR of Turkey in many ways, the modernizer, And so the idea that we revere our politicians or that we view them as being on our side, you know, we're in a situation now where politicians, at least on the national level, are no longer pretending to represent everyone. And they're no longer pretending that democracy gives us this compromise down the middle where the far left, the far right, neither side gets everything it wants, but we come up with something sort of down the middle that we can all live with. That's no longer the pretense. Now it's just like, listen, if you don't vote for me, you're part of the deplorables. And now that I'm elected, my desire is to vanquish you. Now, when I say vanquish, I mean in the political sense. There are worse ways of being vanquished, but nonetheless, the rhetoric is unpleasant and alarming. And so this idea that you don't really have to run for president for the whole country anymore, or if you're a senator from a state, you don't have to represent the entire state anymore. You just represent your constituency, and really not even your voting constituency, but your real constituency. In other words, the people with power who put you in office. I think that's very different than in tone than even 10 years ago. And look, we all know this. I mean, everybody acknowledges this from Michael Malice on down, is that there's always going to be elite rule in any society. That's inevitable. What matters is whether those elites hate your guts or not, or whether they desire a society where average people, let's say middle-class people, can live a pretty decent life.
The social recognition of man's rational nature, of the connection between his survival and his use of reason, is the concept of individual rights. Rights are a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. They are derived from man's nature as a rational being and represent a necessary condition of his particular mode of survival. The right to life is the source of all rights, including the right to property. For a fuller discussion of rights, I refer you to my articles on men's rights and the nature of government in my book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal.
Drone strike on Kremlin, that's okay. But a drone strike on the White House, America goes to war. That's right. Could you imagine if that happened? Oh my God, a drone strike on the White House? It's okay. This thing is heating up. As I say, when all else fails, they take you to war. And guess what some of the good news is? All the plantation workers of Slavelandia? Pentagon announces $1.2 billion Ukraine military aid package. Isn't that great? Happened to gold today. $2,034 an ounce. Tomorrow, the markets are waiting for the consumer price index numbers to come out. And then on Thursday, they got the producer price index numbers coming out. That's going to depend on what the Fed is going to do with interest rates. So one of the things. Again, when they start lowering interest rates, the dollar is going to dive. As the dollar goes lower, gold prices are going to go higher. And as for oil prices, they're moving up again a little bit. But again, we have the Middle East meltdown. Again, when all else fails, they take you to war, and Netanyahu's taking the people to war. Lenders are increasingly reluctant to expend more credit. Oh, yeah, no kidding. We only warned about this office building bust, 3 years ago? Oh, one of your top trends for 2023? Oh, there it is. Office building bust. Yep. Again, we've been warning this for 3 years when they started locking down and telling people to work from home. And now you ready for this? Fed weary over commercial real estate. Wow, blow me the fuck away. I would have never thought that. We've only been saying this and get blacklisted from the media for they won't report it. But now it's become official. It's happening. I'm mentioning this because when you look at the banks that have these loans, these are small and medium-sized banks. The bust has just begun. Again, more information in your economic update. That's why I'm mentioning more on Powell, the freak that said that inflation was temporary and transitory, along with Ms. Facha Bruta, Janet Yellen. And even her, she comes in low. Her rating is 37%. This is the former Fed head. That's now the Treasury Secretary. Could you imagine? Look who's running our government. You got to be stupid not to see it. And you have to be stupid to watch the mainstream news. Nothing more than moronic, imbecilic crap.
In regard to political economy, property rights require special emphasis. Man has to work and produce in order to support his life. He has to support his life by his own effort and by the guidance of his own mind. If he cannot dispose of the product of his effort, he cannot dispose of his effort. If he cannot dispose of his effort, he cannot dispose of his life. Without property rights, no other rights can be practiced. Now, bearing these facts in mind, consider the question of what social system is appropriate to man. A social system is a set of moral, political, economic principles embodied in society's laws, institutions, and government, which determine the relationships, the terms of association among the men living in a given geographical area. There are only two fundamental questions, or two aspects of the same question, that determine the nature of any social system. Does a social system recognize individual rights? And does a social system ban physical force from human relationships? The answer to the second question is the practical implementation of the answer to the first.
I think there were four major items, but I want to read three because it touches on what you said. It says the resolution that encourages North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies to strengthen their engagement with partners in the Indo-Pacific on approaches to shared global security challenge, including peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. I got to thinking all this stuff, and I think we emphasize that we're looking for peace and prosperity, and they are too. So they're supposed to be allies, but they happen to be, doing exactly the opposite of what we had been advised by the founders. What's in the Constitution, that you should not seek, in absence of cooperation with other people, you should seek more trade and more opportunities to work together. And yet we blame us. They blame us for isolationism, and of course, what is happening and why there's a blowback now against our policies, whether it's Ukraine or whether it's China. China is not. They've been able to build up a lot more hatred toward China, which there are problems there, but it doesn't justify what our policy is doing, especially when I sincerely believe the policy that we're following will make things worse and not better, no matter how much credit you give them for. Well, they're well intended, but we need our support from the Europeans. They need to get involved. NATO is bringing them together. So with the NATO arm, I thought NATO had something to do with the North Atlantic Treaty, and defense against Soviets, but that sort of has morphed into something else.
Well, the whole thing is pretty farcical if you look at it a certain way. I mean, Europe has completely depleted its entire arsenal. They've sent literally every last shell. I think they're sending over slingshots now. They've sent every single last piece of weaponry. They swore, they said that they were going to have 1 million new shells we're going to send, and then they can't find them anywhere. They can't buy them. They can't manufacture them. They have literally emptied their arsenals. And you've seen one after the other European defense ministers saying we couldn't last more than 3 or 4 days if we actually had to fight a war, because they've sent everything to Ukraine. So on the one hand, you see this completely depleted. It's the same is true for the U.S. This completely depleted arsenal, and at the same time, they want to take out the biggest kid on the block. They want to go punch China in the eye, and they have no weapons left. So it's absolutely farcical. A lot of what this resolution is that's in the House is to try to force them back in. And here's Biden, who's already led the way. This is from the Daily Caller piece that we put up a second ago. Although the U.S. formally maintains strategic ambiguity about its plans in the event of a Chinese invasion, President Joe Biden has repeatedly suggested he would order the military to defend Taiwan. Now, we don't know if he remembers saying that, but he has said it before. He has said it several times. So he definitely has ramped up the rhetoric on it. The question is there anything to back this rhetoric? Really, we can see now that the Biden presidency is just Obama 3. This is the third term of Obama, because these are the same people with the same policies, wreaking havoc across the region, the same destruction. They did it in Ukraine. It was under Obama that the U.S.-backed coup happened in Ukraine. It was under Obama that the Arab Spring, which was just cover for the U.S. to overthrow all the governments in the region and call it a democracy movement. Of course, it was no such thing. But they did this entire thing. They made neocon interventionists look like slackers. They're hyper-interventionists. None of it worked. None of it worked. And you mentioned it in your piece today. Just a field of disaster after the Obama people came through. And now what does it do? It returns to the status quo ante, albeit with thousands and thousands of less people because they've been all killed.
Blows my mind to think they're over there, visiting Taiwan, and promoting things there. And I was jokingly saying, what's going to happen with that little problem we have with Taiwan versus China if somebody goes and invites Taiwan to join NATO? And the whole idea that we're over there messing around with the internal and external affairs and borders, a long way away from the territory NATO was supposed to be interested in. So I would just ask people to, pay a lot of attention to NATO, because when we, and especially myself, and I'm sure Daniel agrees with this, that when we talk about Ukraine, it's they might say that Ukraine, Russia, fight. Oh, Ukraine, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that ends it right there. But the whole thing is, it started a long time before that, and it was especially accelerated in 2014 when NATO, in a way, became very, very aggressive and participated, along with the United States, obviously, in a coup that got rid of a government that was more open-minded to dealing with Russia. So NATO shouldn't be there. We shouldn't be there. We should allow internal affairs deal with what's going on in countries, and even the border disputes. That is something we don't need to go over to Ukraine and pretend that we are border experts and know exactly what to do and solve problems. I think we have enough challenges right here at home, but people blindly just go along and have supported the war in Ukraine. But the whole thing is more people are starting to oppose it, and this is a wise prediction. This stuff usually ends when a country goes bankrupt, and that's what we're seeing signs of.
Is man a sovereign individual who owns his person, his mind, his life, his work, and its products? Or is he the property of the tribe, the state, the society, the collective, that may dispose of him in any way it pleases, that may dictate his convictions, prescribe the course of his life, control his work, and expropriate his products? Does man have the right to exist for his own sake, or is he born in bondage as an indentured servant who must keep buying his life by serving the tribe, but can never acquire it free and clear? This is the first question to answer. The rest is consequences and practical implementations. The basic issue is only, is man free? In mankind's history, capitalism is the only system that answers yes.
Allegation of this magnitude and this monstrosity.
Well, I've been seeing these theories for as long as you describe, since I was in high school, and basically they're theories. They are based on two things. They're based on the fact that an intelligence agency, particularly in this case, an intelligence agency that specifically had been threatened, shall we say, by JFK and RFK, and in terms of cutting back on its prerogatives, et cetera, had a motive. So that's a big element in this. The other thing is that intelligence agencies, by their very nature and the secrecy that surrounds many of their activities, have the ability to do this. So you put motive and ability together, and it makes a very compelling story. I've never seen any solid proof from someone, say, who was a participant in what took place. And there were others who had motives too. Certainly the Israelis had motives to go after JFK because he was trying to dismantle their nuclear program. So it's a question of where you're looking at and what you want to find. You'll find all kinds of things.
JFK had issued 2 executive orders to draw down troops from Vietnam before he was killed. Okay. Now, one of the little factoids that not many people know is that exactly a month after the JFK assassination, President Truman wrote an op-ed appearing in the Washington Post. And he said, I think it's time to rein in the CIA. It's not doing the kinds of things that I created it for, namely intelligence analysis without treatment. It's doing other things, okay? It was a torrid sort of thing, exactly 1 month after the assassination. It appeared in the first edition of the Washington Post. There used to be 2 later editions, disappeared. Any other broadcast media or any other paper? No. In the Independent Sentinel or whatever it was in the Missouri, it was posted. It completely, the press was onto it even then. Worst came to worst,
with Alan Dulles, the previous head of the CIA, who had mousetrapped Kennedy into the Bay of Pigs fiasco, was appointed by President Johnson to be pretty much the head of the Warren Commission investigating the assassination. When people like me said, no, it's a little odd because a lot of people think the CIA may have been involved. After all, there's a lot of circumstantial. Oh, does this thing have legs? It all depends on how much control the deep state can exercise over the media. They've been immensely successful so far. Look at the Hunter Biden thing, for God's sake. Now, if Robert Kennedy Jr. can force this up and out and have decent people take another look at it, it's going to be very damning. Because why indeed is the CIA, why is the FBI refusing to declassify documents that by act of Congress should have been declassified 3 years ago? Why are they doing that? I don't know. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but that they might have something to hide.
Let me just jump in at this point on what you just said, because of conversations which I've discussed publicly, as has he. So I'm not revealing any secrets. Conversations I had with President Trump when he was in the White House. So he called me about 2 or 3 weeks before he left office to ask my opinion on some of the people he was about to pardon. And then I said, Mr. President, can I raise, after giving him my opinion on the pardons, and I won't mention any of those names, but Mr. President, do you remember promising me personally and the American public that you would, before you leave the White House, open up the JFK assassination files? Yes, I do remember promising that. Well, you only have 2 weeks left. And he said to me, Judge, if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't open up those files either. And I said, what do you mean? He said, someday when we're talking together and there aren't 15 people listening, because he was calling me from the White House switchboard, I will tell you what I saw. And then we ended the conversation. What could he have seen?
He could have seen the truth. He could have seen the plotting. It all fits together very nicely. This book is based on all the evidence up to date. That's about 15 years ago. But there's secret evidence in CIA cables and FBI cables and so forth. It's got to be there. Otherwise, they would release it. So the teaching point I take from this, Judge, is that the presidents of the United States, including Donald Trump, are too afraid to do what they can do on their own authority.
Capitalism is a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. The recognition of individual rights entails the banishment of physical force from human relationships. Basically, rights can be violated only by means of force. In a capitalist society, no man or group may initiate the use of physical force against others. The only function of the government in such a society is the task of protecting man's rights. That is, the task of protecting him from physical force. The government acts as the agent of man's right of self-defense and may use force only in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use. Thus, the government is the means of placing the retaliatory use of force under objective control.
What are the best arguments that they make that you feel really need to be confronted here?
Okay, well, I'll break it down like this. I feel like depending on what your perspective is, maybe there really is a real China threat. Because I view it this way. If you view the existence of other states that can act as a check on Washington, D.C., doing whatever they want, wherever they want, without anyone able to stop them, if you view that as a threat, then sure, China is a threat. The China threat is real. If you think the United States should just be able to sail aircraft carriers right up in China's face all day and just act belligerently, those days are done. Those days are done. So in that sense, yes, in the same way that the resurrected Russian state eventually was able to act as a check on the neocons and liberal internationalists, yes. But in terms of threatening core U.S. national interests, there's absolutely nothing there. Just in the same way the Hawks try and scare us about Russia having a naval base on the Red Sea in Sudan, like that's like they're about to invade California or something. It's just not true. So,
all right, but so, as you say, their power has grown. There's an analyst that I really like named Lyle Goldstein, who says that he believes they are preparing to invade Taiwan. And when I asked him what makes him say so, he says, because they're building up a naval force to do it. That's why. And so he doesn't get all into the nitty gritty of the politics there. He's just a military analyst, and he's saying they are definitely building up a substantial naval force here. So when you say check the United States, if all we're doing is keeping the peace and the sea lanes open, then that means that they plan on closing them all down and starting a war, right?
Well, they've never intimated that they want to have a war over Taiwan. Much of this stems from the behavior of the United States, which began under the Clinton administration and then the George W. Bush administration, although I have to give George W. Bush a tiny bit of credit here, I'll come back to that, encouraging Taiwanese independence, which was never part of the deal, encouraging high-level diplomatic relations, putting U.S. troops, training, more weapons. Like this was never really part of the understanding. The understanding, which was confirmed by both parties, Republican and Democrat, under Nixon and then under Carter, was that the United States would encourage peaceful reunification. Beijing does not actually have any interest in precipitating a war over this, but the continued provocations by the United States are making it where it would be rather foolish of a statist, which all of these people are statists. They want state power. They are preparing to defend what they view as the state's interests. And having an unsinkable aircraft carrier for potential U.S. Ships, more weapons, they don't want that. And they're in a position now to do something about it. So let's see. Hawke's best arguments. I think one of the Hawke's best arguments is that China has so many extra men due to selective sex abortion. They have tens of millions of extra young men. And actually the unemployment rate in China has risen steadily over the last 15 years. That's really the best argument, I think, for why they might want to throw them into a meat grinder, either with India in a border war or over Taiwan. But really, I mean, it's a high-risk endeavor, especially Taiwan. It's an island. We're talking amphibious assault. I do like Lyle Goldstein's stuff, and I do think they are preparing to have that capability. But I do think that the view from Beijing is that, much like the United States security planners, going back a century, believe that eventually Cuba would just fall into the orbit of the United States and that it would naturally settle there due to economic reasons. I think that has long been the belief, that eventually Taiwan, which does most of its trading with the mainland, would eventually gradually just becoming more and more part of China, and eventually would just be de facto if it was never de jure. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I think one of the things that's important is to look at how U.S. media reports what goes on, because while Kevin McCarthy was, doing whatever stupid thing he needed to do to show that he was as tough as Nancy Pelosi, the leader of the other party in Taiwan, the KMT, was in Beijing, basically saying, look, we don't want any part of this. We just want good relations with you. We want our economic ties to stay the same. And there's an election coming up, and it's going to be very interesting because the KMT did very well in the regional elections this last year, and this is the party that wants to be closer to mainland China, that does not want provocation. So I'm going to be watching that very closely.
Well, we know what'll happen if they vote wrong. America will cancel the results of the election in the name of democracy. That's how it works.
They're ringed by other states, most of which are perfectly capable of defending themselves. The Gobi Desert, yes, desertification is a huge problem in China, as is just massive environmental catastrophe. I mean, China has less water per capita, potable water per capita than Saudi Arabia. I mean, they're just the desert is encroaching on Beijing to such an extent that if something drastic doesn't happen, which I don't know what they could possibly do. They tried planting a bunch of trees, but they planted the wrong kind, and so they all died. But they're trying to prevent the desert literally running right up into Beijing. Beijing is in the northeastern part of China there.
And they have very little oil too, right? I think you wrote that they're completely dependent on international trade. They're the most globalized economy, whereas America would probably be all right if we somehow got isolated by the rest of the world. They would not be.
It's interesting. If you shut off globalization tomorrow, the United States is one of the only states that could reasonably be confident that they could feed and fuel their own people. China would have absolutely no chance. It would be mass famine, death in darkness everywhere, almost immediately. Yes, it's true.
Yeah. All right, you guys, this is Joe Solis Mullen. He wrote the book, The Fake China Threat, which will be coming out soon, published by the Institute. And he wrote this great piece at the Institute, What the China Literature Gets Wrong. Thanks very much for your time, Joe.
Thanks, Scott. As always, pleasure.
It is the basic metaphysical fact of man's nature, the connection between his survival and his use of reason, that capitalism recognizes and protects. In a capitalist society, all human relationships are voluntary. Men are free to cooperate or not, to deal with one another or not, as their own individual judgments, convictions, and interests dictate. They can deal with one another only in terms of and by means of reason. That is, by means of discussion, persuasion, and contractual agreement, by voluntary choice to mutual benefit. The right to agree with others is not a problem in any society. It is the right to disagree that is crucial. It is the institution of private property that protects and implements the right to disagree, and thus keeps the road open to man's most valuable attribute, the creative mind. This is the cardinal difference between capitalism and any form of collectivism.
So Biden family tried to hide over 10 million in foreign payments, claims the House GOP. Now, when I saw that, Dr. Paul, I was a little disappointed because 10 million kind of seems like small potatoes, but maybe that's the tip of the iceberg. But here's a summary according to Zero Hedge, which I think is a pretty fair beginning of what they found. The Biden family received and tried to hide over 10 million in payments from foreign nationals. A previously undisclosed $1 million in Romanian-linked payments, that's weird, ties to Romanian influence peddling, a web of 20 limited liability companies created while Biden was vice president with a complicated corporate structure. At least 15 of those LLCs were formed after he became VP in 2009, several of which were co-owned or co-owned by Hunter, you know, that notoriously brilliant businessman and painter and author and role model for millions of Americans. Anyway, I'm just joking. These LLCs accepted payments ranging from $5,000 to $3 million. The committee wants to know what legitimate business the Biden family was in. Now, that's the real question. So you set up all these companies around your family while you're vice president. You're doing millions of dollars worth of business. So the question is, what are you buying and selling something? What is the product? What are you making? What are you creating? What's going on? That's probably a legitimate question. How did you earn these $10 million?
Well, this is going to put the president in a little bit of a bind because the evidence looks like it's accumulating, and he's going to have a hard time because he like a father ordinarily does. They can't stand, you know, to see a child, a son, in trouble. Yeah. So he has declared that Hunter is the smartest man he ever met,
nice.
and a great bullsman.
Well, he was in Washington, so that could be true.
Smartest man in the administration. Yeah. Now it's a sad story, but it's a consequence of corruption. They're you know, the whole process. And 98% of everything they do up there does not fit into the category of, oh, well, let's check it out and see if it's in Article 1, Section 8. Do you think we have permission to do this? And all this nonsense. And you talk about could this have anything to do with inflation, the banking system, the interventionist foreign policy we have, the military-industrial complex? Who knows what it could involve? But I'll tell you what, if we had a true republic, this kind of nonsense wouldn't be going on.
So here's what Turley said, a couple of tweets. During this period, Biden, in May 2014, was speaking about corruption in Romania, okay? And then in September of 2015, a little over a year later, Biden welcomed the Romanian president to Washington. Oh, must have fixed the problem. Then 5 weeks after that, money flowed to the Biden associates through multiple accounts. Haley Biden received some of this money as well. The $3 million payment from Romania is clearly a focus of the committee, writes Turley. Armstrong saying that Romanian payments follow a pattern with the Chinese payments. Biden comes over there and says, you guys are all corrupt, you're terrible, this and that. A little bit later he says, hey, you guys are all right now. And then the money starts flowing.
Maybe they've just developed a casual, honest friendship, and they visit on occasion. Now, that is obviously a huge mess, but I think it's going to linger for a while. And if indeed this was going on when Biden was vice president, just became vice president, and was wheeling and dealing, my guess is that there's been a lot in between, between those dates and what's going on now. I think it's you know, persistent, and that's the way Washington operates. But sometimes they aren't too smart on how they hide these things, all this stuff.
Greedy.
You know, they have information, but they did pull something off. The briefcase is an interesting story. Hunter's briefcase, all this information, and they were able to, you know, with all this evidence, they're able to get 51 top people in our security department, and you also practically swear on an oath. Oh, this is all Russia's fault. You know, and then they find out. A lot of people say, you know, if I had known that, I don't think I'd have voted for this guy. But that is such a shame. But it's sort of amazing how they get away with it. But it's a combination of a corrupt society. It's amazing about a justice department that goes on, and they are able to do it. And I think the political system, just the election that we're engaged in, and I have had a little bit of experience there. And there's a lot of cheating that goes on in it.
I guess we should move on. This is kind of a heads up on legislation. If we could do the next one. This is thanks to our friend Ryan McMakin over at the Mises Institute. This is from Mises Wire. The new immigration bill is a Trojan horse for E-Verify and is a threat to all Americans. Now, you've been writing about E-Verify for years and years, warning people about it, and it looks like it's reared its head again.
You know, it was early on because the original bill on that came up was in 1997, and that was the year I went back to Congress. I got rested up. I was there a few terms, then went back to medicine, but in 96 I ran again, so that was early on. And really it was the monetary issue and foreign policy that had motivated me, but the security issue and the privacy issue became something I got intensely interested in. And you mentioned Norm Singleton's name, and Norm Norm was a good researcher on it and kept close eye on this. And this is something that is devastating. It's going to tremendously increase the power of the federal government.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for a system of knowing everything that goes on, this will be a concession. Right now, what is available is that you can voluntarily do it, and the states under the Constitution can do it, and some of the states are doing it. But if you put it in this bill the way it is, we have to remind people that if you listen to some conservatives and libertarians, and they might say, well, this bill is not all that bad. It's sort of curtailing some of the things the federal government's doing. And it's true. But that's not unusual that they'll put a few good things in and put the member of Congress in a bind. I can't vote against that. It's improving it here, but it's destroying it over here. And my rule to myself to keep me thinking straight is you can't compromise on it, because if you give up, let's just say 5% of the bill is bad.
Yeah.
Well, if you do this, give 5% of your freedoms up in order to get something that should be automatic with the Constitution, eventually you don't have much freedom left. So I don't like that at all. But there are some things in there that on the surface looks like it could be beneficial in protecting the people, but that hasn't. The people have not responded on that issue. They'll say, well, they better look at the big picture and what it means. And this is a massive surveillance system, and the federal government will be running it for all kinds of reasons that they'll want to do.
Well, the bill is called the Border Security and Verification Act of 2023, and I believe Ryan said it's going to be on the floor this week. I haven't looked at the floor schedule this week, but as you say, Ryan points out that buried in the bill, among other things that are probably not that awfully bad, is this nationwide E-Verify mandate. And it's been around, and a few states have adopted it as states, but this will be nationwide. It'll be a nationwide database. What it means is that you have to prove to your employer that the federal government allows you to work. Now, a lot of Republicans and conservatives are opposite of your position on this, because they say, we got to keep those illegals from their jobs. We can't let them work. Not realizing that it's not just illegals that are going to have to show their papers to work. It's every single American. And back when Norm and I and the rest were working on this, we talked about how many false positives and false negatives there were. You could be trying to get a job, and you enter your verification, and you're rejected for a government error reason. You may not get that job. It can go on and on. So, but a lot of Republicans and conservatives would say, oh, Ron, this is wrong. It's not going to go after regular Americans, just after illegals. Well, these are the same people that said, oh, Ron, the Patriot Act is only going to target terrorists. They're not going to spy on us. It's never going to happen. So it's, once bitten, twice shy. It should be, unfortunately, on this. This does not sound like Ukraine is winning to me.
During the campaign, when I would bring up this subject and suggested that we bring the troops home, which they interpreted as being surrendering. Yeah, surrendering our stupid policy, that's one thing. But the one thing that they would use that was the most difficult, because it's very sensitive, and that is there's a lot of people died for this, and a lot of people have been injured, and if you just walk away, are you going to, and they pointed right to me and they said, does that mean you're going to allow them to have died in vain? Yeah. And how do you answer that? And I would say that if they die in vain, I said, how is sending more in there, more money, more troops, more death, more destruction, more attacks on our liberties, and say that will do something to assuage the dying in vain business? Yeah. You have to stop it's only worthwhile if you learn something about these disasters. But we might learn a lesson for a week or two or deceive the people for a little bit, but until they decide that the principle of the foreign policy ought to be somewhat related to the principle designed in our Constitution, this is going to continue, and then it gets really messy when we have to declare the next stage of our bankruptcy.
Yeah, exactly.
It says U.S. government cancels $42 billion in public service workers' student loans. And then I look into this, and that's just a little bit. They've been doing it all along, but Biden wants to move it up to $400 billion. I wonder where he's going to get this money, go on. But the program is deeply flawed. And guess who? The people who either never got some benefits or the ones who paid back their loans, they're the ones who are going to be taxed for this. So it just was not part of a moral society. It's not part of a constitutional society for people to be taking money from one group and giving it to other. And then the benefits of this cannot outweigh the violations of our liberties, and pretty soon it's going to add up to a lot of money. But it's still there. And the other thing that impressed me or annoyed me was the fact that it's an announcement. I thought, well, maybe they don't even have legislation to do it. No, there is legislation, but the management of it falls into the hands of the executive branch, and it's a program that was started in 2007. So they've been giving assurances to certain individuals. But this new bailout will be for government employees. They're already on the dole. And different groups have qualified under that first program in 2007. But the goal is to blanket, just to give it, declare the whole thing bankrupt. And that to me is sad. I happen to believe that there's a different way to do this. I was in office when Carter was in office, and he made the Department of Education, national and taken over, even though it was Eisenhower that started all that nationalization of our education system. But that is, something that we shouldn't have. We shouldn't have a Department of Education. We shouldn't have the federal government in education. There's other ways to do it. The early history of our country depended on more local, private education, but it didn't take long for the government to get involved, because that is their number one goal. If you read the theories of many who want totalitarianism, and then they admit it, the socialists, Marxists, and communists, they admit control education. And I also believe very sincerely that the destruction of our republic started a little over 100 years ago, when the progressives entered into this education business wholesale and were able to take over our school system, both at the college level as well as at the local level. There's an easy answer for this. Just look for guidance from the Constitution and look for peace and prosperity through the limitation of government power, and it can be achieved.
The moral justification of capitalism does not lie in the altruist claim that it represents the best way to achieve the common good. It is true that capitalism does, if that catchphrase has any meaning, but this is merely a secondary consequence. The moral justification of capitalism lies in the fact that it is the only system consonant with man's rational nature, that it protects man's survival qua man, and that its ruling principle is justice. Every social system is based explicitly or implicitly on some theory of ethics. The tribal notion of the common good has served as the moral justification of most social systems and of all tyrannies in history. The degree of a society's enslavement or freedom corresponded to the degree to which that tribal slogan was invoked or ignored. The common good, or the public interest, is an undefined and undefinable concept. There is no such entity as the tribe or the public. The tribe or the public or society is only a number of individual men. Nothing can be good for the tribe as such. Good and value pertain only to a living organism, to an individual living organism, not to a disembodied aggregate of relationships.
The US and the UK vowed to support Ukraine no matter what. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his British counterpart James Cleverly vowed on Tuesday that the US and Britain will continue supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia, regardless of the result of Kiev's expected counteroffensive. Cleverly said at a joint press conference with Blinken in Washington, quote, "We need to continue to support them, irrespective of whether this forthcoming offensive generates huge gains on the battlefield, because until this conflict is resolved and resolved properly, it is not over," end quote.
We have maniacal, evil people in charge. This is the quote in response to that from Antony Blinken, the United States Secretary of State, and how, since he's been in Washington, has loved every war, from the Iraq war to the Afghan war, to the Syrian wars, to the Libyan wars, to every war. Oh, the Antony Blinken that went over to Saudi Arabia when the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Barack Obama, he was an undersecretary of state under him, Went there when the Saudis invaded Yemen and have killed nearly 400,000 Yemenis, half of which are under the age of 5. That Antony Blinken to bring intelligence and other vital information to help the Saudis win. A war that began in 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 8 years later. So here's his response.
So Blinken strongly backed Cleverly's comments. Listen to this quote from him. He said, quote, "I can only violently agree with my friend and strongly endorse what he's just said. We have exactly the same perspective," end quote.
Violently agree? In all my life, I've never heard that term before. Violently. We violently agree to keep killing and murdering. Violently agree? And nobody talks about this. This is satanic. Violently agree? So, one after another. One country in Europe after another ramping up spending to build up the war machine. Preparing to fight. So, it's up to the people to stop it, unless you want these leaders to lead you to death, because that's where they're taking us.
The next one here, hawks urge sanctions to stop Syria normalization. So the top Republican and Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee released a statement on Monday slamming Syria's readmission into the Arab League and urging President Biden to use sanctions to prevent further normalization. So this was Representative Michael McCaul, who is the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Republican, and then the top Democrat on the committee, Gregory Meeks. They said in a statement, quote, "Readmitting Assad to the Arab League is a grave strategic mistake that will embolden Assad, Russia, and Iran to continue butchering civilians and destabilizing the Middle East. The United States must fully enforce the Caesar Act and other sanctions to freeze normalization efforts with this war criminal," end quote. So the Caesar Act that they mentioned, that imposed crushing economic sanctions on Syria in 2020 that are specifically designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. And that's what Blinken has said, that it's U.S. policy to oppose the reconstruction of Syria. And these sanctions have had a devastating impact on Syria's civilians, naturally. The House recently voted overwhelmingly to keep enforcing sanctions after that devastating earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey in February, and that killed thousands of Syrians. But the House voted to keep them under sanctions. And so what makes the Caesar Act sanctions so sweeping is that they allow the U.S. to sanction any person or entity for doing business with the Syrian government. So this means that U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, which spearheaded the effort to bring Syria back into the fold, back into the Arab League, they could potentially be targeted. State Department spokesman Patel said on Monday, quote, "We do not believe that Syria merits readmission to the Arab League at this time. We continue to believe that we will not normalize our relations with the Assad regime, and we don't support our allies and partners doing so either," end quote. So on top of the crippling sanctions, the U.S. has about 900 troops in eastern Syria and backs the Kurdish-led SDF, allowing the U.S. to control about 1/3 of the country where most of its oil resources are located. Syria's normalization with its neighbors could complicate the U.S.'s plans to keep occupying the country.
When the common good of a society is regarded as something apart from and superior to the individual good of its members, it means that the good of some men takes precedence over the good of others, with those others consigned to the status of sacrificial animals. What makes the victims accepted and permits a society to perpetrate a moral atrocity of that kind? The answer lies in philosophy, in philosophical theories on the nature of moral values. There are, in essence, three schools of thought on the nature of the good: the intrinsic, the subjective, and the objective. The intrinsic theory holds that the good is inherent in certain things or actions as such, regardless of their context and consequences, regardless of any benefit or injuries they may cause to the actors and subjects involved. It is a theory that divorces the concept of good from beneficiaries and the concept of value from valuer and purpose, claiming that the good is good in, by, and of itself. The subjective theory holds that the good bears no relation to the facts of reality, that it is the product of a man's consciousness, created by his feelings, desires, intuitions, or whims, and that it is merely an arbitrary postulate or an emotional commitment. The intrinsic theory holds that the good resides in some sort of reality independent of man's consciousness. The subjective theory holds that the good resides in man's consciousness independent of reality. The objective theory holds that the good is neither an attribute of things in themselves nor of man's emotional states, but an evaluation of the facts of reality by man's consciousness according to a rational standard of value. Rational in this context means derived from the facts of reality and validated by a process of reason. The objective theory holds that the good is an aspect of reality in relation to man, and that it must be discovered, not invented by man. Fundamental to an objective theory of values is the question of value to whom and for what. An objective theory does not permit context dropping or concept stealing. It does not permit the separation of value from purpose, of the good from beneficiaries, and of man's actions from reason. Of all the social systems in mankind's history, capitalism is the only system based on an objective theory of values.
So major escalations going on in the war in Ukraine, but that doesn't mean the U.S. isn't meddling in the Asia-Pacific as well. This article, China tells U.S. it must respect red lines to foster communications. Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang and U.S. Ambassador to China Nicholas Burns held talk on Monday as tensions are soaring between the two nations. The meeting came after Burns said Washington was ready to talk with Beijing as communications have broken down after Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled a trip to China over the Chinese balloon that wound up in the U.S. airspace. Quinn's message is that in order to foster communications, the U.S. must respect China's position, including its red lines over Taiwan. It's not possible to talk about communications on one hand and keep suppressing and containing China on the other hand, Quinn said, according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry readout. We must respect China's bottom line and red line and stop undermining China's sovereignty, security, and development interests. In particular, we must correctly handle the Taiwan issue, stop hollowing out the One China principle, and stop supporting and condoning Taiwan independence, separatist forces, the readout said. And so this is what I expected to happen, that China is going to say that talks with the U.S. are only going to come after the U.S. shows that it has some respect for China. And if you've seen anything going on in the U.S. politically and even the discussion around the White House, there is no desire to have any respect for China whatsoever.
The intrinsic theory and the subjectivist theory, or a mixture of both, are the necessary base of every dictatorship, tyranny, or variant of the absolute state, whether they are held consciously or subconsciously, in the explicit form of a philosopher's treatise, or in the implicit chaos of its echoes in an average man's feelings. These theories make it possible for a man to believe that the good is independent of man's mind and can be achieved by physical force. If a man believes that the good is intrinsic in certain actions, he will not hesitate to force others to perform them. If he believes that the human benefit or injury caused by such actions is of no significance, he will regard a sea of blood as of no significance. If he believes that the beneficiaries of such actions are irrelevant or interchangeable, He will regard wholesale slaughter as his moral duty in the service of a, quote, higher good, unquote. It is the intrinsic theory of values that produces a Robespierre, a Lenin, a Stalin, or a Hitler. It is not an accident that Eichmann was a Kantian.
The ATF has declared a new form of trigger to be a machine gun. So you squeeze a trigger and a round comes out. You release the trigger and it's ready for another round to come out. That's called semi-automatic. Those are the 300 million guns that are in the United States. You squeeze a trigger and hold it back and all the rounds in the gun come out. That's called automatic. Unlawful in the United States since 1934, except for the government, which has them. It's interesting because when Justice Scalia wrote the Heller decision, there's a section in there about what guns can you legally own. And he says, whatever guns the bad guys have and whatever guns, you ready for this, the government has. So one wonders if the prohibition on automatic weapons, which civilians are prohibited from owning, shouldn't apply also to the government. Because if the government owns them, then under the Heller decision, we should be able to own them as well. Okay, the ATF comes up with a new regulation that if you have a gun where the trigger goes back real quickly, too quickly for the ATF's comfort, that is an automatic weapon. Even though you have to pull that trigger each time you want a round to come out. If the trigger goes back too quickly for the ATF's comfort, I said ATM, I meant ATF. These are the thugs. These are the bureaucrats. You'll see them in a minute that regulate our guns. They create the rule. They enforce the rule. They decide who has violated the rule. They are judge, jury, and executioner. Here's what happened last week when they approached the guy who understands his constitutional rights. This is about a minute.
So the reason why we're here is because I don't know. I'm sure you're aware that just recently the ATF classified the FRTs, the force reset triggers, as machine guns. Yeah. So we are aware that you may have purchased some of these FRTs. Okay. So now we are having, like, the whole agency is basically reaching out to these purchasers.
That's incredible.
And we have to pick them up. They're illegal. So
I won't be answering any questions today. I don't have any comments on this subject. I won't be giving you anything.
Okay, so you...
Are you refusing to give us the trigger? I'm not refusing anything. I won't be answering any questions.
Okay. But okay, so we are aware that you did purchase FRTs. Again, you wouldn't be in trouble if you just gave those up to us, or if you sold them, you can tell me you sold them.
Sure.
And you're not going to be in trouble for that.
I understand.
So we're just here, honestly, just to pick them up.
Sure. It's a bigger conversation than what you're having right now. You decide as you go the rules, right?
Again, that's not something I decide.
It's not. I know. You guys are just here. You guys are just here.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all.
I understand.
I don't want to be here any more than you want me to
Sure.
be here.
It's the problem is you are the people who go and knock on the doors, right? Mm-hmm. So when they make new laws and you break them, or you go against the citizens, because they've spoken what they buy and what they do, the citizens are speaking, but the government is making their decisions on what they think. They're not being servants to the citizens, right?
Wow. There's a lesson in understanding the freedom of speech in the Second Amendment. If the ATF shows up at your door and they don't have a warrant, they obviously didn't, or they would have showed it to him. Simply say, I have nothing to say to you, goodbye. And if they don't leave, call the local police and tell the local police there are 2 people at my front door with guns and they won't leave. You'll see an army of local police show up and escort the ATF out. They have no right to be judge, jury, and executioner. They have no right to decide which of your weapons are lawful and which are not. They have no right to confiscate anything from you without a warrant. That's what we call black letter law, meaning it's the law of the land. It is beyond dispute. Try to have the courage that this man had. I have nothing to say to you. I'm not refusing your request. I'm just not answering it. Have a nice day. Goodbye. And again, if they don't leave, call the police. Owe money to the descendants of slaves has changed his mind. Well, why did he change his mind? Because he can't afford it. He changed his mind because the Reparations Commission that he appointed recommended $1,200,000 to every African-American living in the state of California, whether that person can trace his ancestry to a slave or not. California, of course, was a free state. There was no legal slavery in California. I don't defend slavery at all. It's the worst thing that ever happened in the history of the world, that a human being would own another human being as property. roundly, soundly condemned. Took a long time to eradicate it. But the idea that the present generation owes money to descendants of slaves is absurd. The present generation had nothing to do with slavery. I can safely say there isn't a human being on the planet today who was involved in the enslavement of African Americans in the United States. So the Reparations Commission in California came up with the idea that it will cost $630 billion with a B dollars to give all the African Americans in California $1,200,000 in cash, tax-free, to compensate them for the vestiges of slavery. Is it any wonder that the governor of California has changed his mind? Look, this whole thing about reparations is absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Everybody wants a freebie. It's the problem with democracy. It's the problem with democracy. Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton hated each other and disagreed on everything imaginable involving the government, except this one thing. They both agreed that when the public treasury becomes a public trough and people learn that they can take money from it by sending people to Washington who will do so, they will only send people to Washington who will promise to bring home the bigger piece of the pie. The have-nots will gang up on the haves and take their wealth away from them. This reparations nonsense is another example of that happening. It's a defect in democracy. It's why we have an independent judiciary to prevent the theft of life, liberty, and property without due process. I don't care if California has the $630 billion sitting around in a bank account. They don't. I don't care if the legislature of California decides to give it away. I don't care if the governor signs that legislation. The Constitution doesn't permit it because it's theft of property without a trial, without due process. At some point, enough is enough. And Gavin Newsom, the champion of reparations, has finally seen the errors of his way. Governor Newsom, welcome to the truth.
If a man believes that the good is a matter of arbitrary subjective choice, the issue of good or evil becomes for him an issue of my feelings or theirs. No bridge, understanding, or communication is possible to him. Reason is the only means of communication among men, and an objectively perceivable reality is their only common frame of reference. When these are invalidated, that is, held to be irrelevant in the field of morality, force becomes man's only way of dealing with one another. If the subjectivist wants to pursue some social ideal of his own, he feels morally entitled to force men, quote, for their own good, unquote, since he feels that he is right and that there is nothing to oppose him but their misguided feelings. Thus, in practice, the proponents of the intrinsic and the subjectivist schools meet and blend. It is doubtful whether anyone can hold either of these theories as an actual, if mistaken, conviction. But both serve as a rationalization of power lust and of rule by brute force, unleashing the potential dictator and disarming his victims.
So following Israeli airstrikes in Gaza that killed at least 10 civilians, including 5 children, the State Department said that it supports Israel's right to protect itself. Israel began targeting the Gaza Strip on Tuesday. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, the initial round of airstrikes killed 15 people, including 4 children, 6 other civilians, and 3 members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So in an email, I asked the State Department to comment on the airstrikes, and a State Department spokesperson told me, quote, "We are closely following the Israeli airstrikes in the Gaza Strip that killed 3 leaders of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Israel has the right to protect itself and its people from indiscriminate rocket attacks launched by terrorist groups. We are also aware of reports that 10 civilians were tragically killed in the Israeli strikes. We call for all parties to de-escalate the situation," end quote. So that's a pretty strong, endorsement of Israel's operations. They mention the 10 civilians that were reported killed. But, the first part is key there. They support Israel's right to protect itself. They call bombing Gaza and killing 10 civilians protecting themselves. And, if you look at what Israel did there, is that they bombed these these Islamic Jihad guys in their homes, and they lived in apartment buildings, and they killed their families, and they killed other people from other families. So look at that ratio, 10 civilians killed, 3 of the Islamic Jihad guys killed. And then there were 2 other people killed on Tuesday, but it's not clear exactly who they were from what I've read. And then later on Wednesday, the Pentagon said that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke with his Israeli counterpart, the Israeli defense minister, and reaffirmed the U.S.'s ironclad support for Israel. So Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang said Tuesday that China would communicate with all relevant parties in its efforts to push for a ceasefire in Ukraine. Qin made the comments alongside his German counterpart, Annalena Baerbock, in Berlin. So he said, quote, as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and responsible major country, China will neither watch the fire from the other bank nor add fuel to the fire. China is willing to maintain communication with relevant parties, including Germany, to achieve an early ceasefire. End quote. So after Chinese President Xi Jinping recently held a call with Zelensky, Beijing announced that it would send a special envoy to Ukraine to work toward a ceasefire. China is sending Li Hu, who is a fluent Russian speaker, and he served as the Chinese ambassador to Russia for 10 years until 2019. Other countries have joined Beijing's calls for peace in Ukraine, including Brazil. And Lula, the Brazilian president, he said on Tuesday that he would offer Brazil as a mediator to settle the war in Ukraine on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Japan later this month. I guess he's attending that summit. So Qin also warned against EU plans to sanction Chinese companies for allegedly supporting Russia's war effort. So according to the Financial Times, the EU has a list of potential sanctions. That includes 8 Chinese companies over claims that they're selling equipment that could be used in weapons. Qin said, quote, there is a normal exchange and cooperation between Chinese and Russian companies. This must not be disrupted.
The objective theory of values is the only moral theory incompatible with rule by force. Capitalism is the only system based implicitly on an objective theory of values, and the historic tragedy is that this has never been made explicit. If one knows that the good is objective, that is, determined by the nature of reality, but to be discovered by man's mind, one knows that an attempt to achieve the good by physical force is a monstrous contradiction in terms, which negates morality at its root by destroying man's capacity to recognize the good, that is, his capacity to value. Force invalidates and paralyzes a man's judgment, demanding that he act against it, thus rendering him morally impotent. A value which one is forced to accept at the price of surrendering one's mind is not a value to anyone. The forcibly mindless can neither judge nor choose nor value. An attempt to achieve the good by force is like an attempt to provide a man with a picture gallery at the price of cutting out his eyes. Values cannot exist, cannot be valued outside the full context of a man's life, needs, goals, and knowledge. The objective view of values permeates the entire structure of a capitalist society.
To the average American, who maybe thinks it was a lot of inconvenience, but, well, I guess we just had to do it. Where would you begin with that person if you have like a minute?
Right. That's a great question. I think that I would try to say that it's a comprehensive case against everything that they did and all the measures that they tried and the passports and the mandates and the amount of information that they were giving to the public that was just blatantly incorrect, that was never acknowledged. And also how they kind of launder that information through the media, where you have the media kind of promoting these measures, promoting mandates and lockdowns. One of the examples is Germany, where you have The Atlantic writing this article saying Germany is doing so much better than the United States because of vaccine passports and high quality masking. And then Germany goes far past the United States in terms of COVID cases and other metrics within just a couple of weeks afterwards. So the pitch would be, it's a comprehensive case against all of these measures and how the experts kind of used media partners to spread their message to people and to encourage compliance with things that didn't work. And then they never acknowledged it after they got it wrong.
And the thing is, after they got it wrong, sometimes every once in a while they would admit that it was wrong, but, well, we couldn't have known that at the time. And like, whatever. Occasionally when they do admit it, we'll get some kind of excuse. But what would often happen is we would all kind of realize that something had been wrong, and yet you would still be penalized on, let's say, YouTube for pointing it out, even though everybody now knows it. Now, my understanding is I do believe they have modified it so that you can be critical of masks now. But what kind of a society is this that I'm not even sure what I'm allowed to criticize now? Even with the whole thing over, that's crazy.
Exactly. And I think that's another very important point to bring up is that there's this kind of homogenous blob of groupthink where experts kind of set the rules of what we're allowed to talk about. Social media companies enforce those rules based off of fact checks and things like that that are often entirely incorrect. And it creates this like false consensus where people are not allowed to even discuss the possibility that these policies aren't working, even though we can all see it in front of our face. And that was kind of the point with both of the books, really, is to show we all knew this. This was happening in real time. We could see it wasn't working and they just wouldn't let up. And it's a really dangerous precedent to set that experts who are wrong about everything, even if, and to be fair, even if they were right, it shouldn't be okay, but they were wrong about all of this and they were still allowed to kind of censor discussion, censor debate. Fauci out there saying, I am the science. The New Zealand prime minister saying, we are your sole source of truth and information. No, that's an incredibly dangerous precedent to set for any issue, but especially for one when we can all see that they're lying right in front of our faces. We have the data, we have the evidence, and especially considering that they had the evidence pre-COVID to suggest a lot of this stuff wouldn't work. Now, this isn't new. There were pandemic planning scenarios and documents created just for this exact scenario, and they completely ignored it all. They panicked, they threw all of it out, got it wrong, and then never had to acknowledge it. And I think it's really important that we keep hammering that point home to ensure that this never happens again.
Right? I think that has to be step one. Didn't work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there's definitely good arguments to be made that that could be a significant possibility. And I think there are, I always say it's kind of a combination of things where you have groups of people, and especially like the CDC and the governor of California out there saying, we're going to use this to change how we govern society. And we want to rethink how we govern society. And you have the CDC when the vaccine comes out and they're saying this is 100% effective and no one that gets it will get sick and no one that gets it will die. And instead of prioritizing elderly people who everybody knows are at the highest risk, they say we're going to target distribution based off of equity and things like teachers unions and racial and other breakdowns. I mean, that's insane. And that shows you that they did kind of view this as an opportunity to rethink and reshape how they want to run the country and how they want to run these jurisdictions. And that's dangerous. But it's also, I think part of it is just it's incompetence, it's hubris, it's arrogance, and it's groupthink where they don't have anybody in their lives that questions what they think. And you see that when some of these outside groups like the Great Barrington Declaration, people like us, when we did question it, and now we have these emails that have come out later, that they see it, and instead of engaging with the arguments or saying, you know, maybe we should rethink this, their first instinct is, we got to censor, we got to control, we got to stop what people see. We don't want them being able to make decisions for themselves. That's not okay to me. It's like we said, the first step is showing that they were wrong, they did get this stuff wrong, and they never really admitted it. I think there was just this kind of like assumption that whatever they said was true and accurate because they said it, not because it was backed up by data. And that's, I think it's been one of the biggest problems throughout COVID was that they were making these pronouncements without evidence to back it up, but it gets immediately proliferated through the media. And then these politicians that were looking to Fauci for guidance on every issue, especially in blue states, took that as, okay, well, vaccinated people are dead ends with the virus, got to have vaccine passports, got to have vaccine mandates, got to mandate it for school kids. And you have these insane pronouncements like Gavin Newsom later on, and he says, oh, we have all these other vaccine mandates for school kids, why not COVID too? Well, there's a big difference between the smallpox vaccine and the COVID vaccine. And I think that it kind of, that spirals out of control. And there's a political part of it too, where Fauci goes, I don't want to hurt the side that's been with me the whole time. I can't go back and now say, oh, I got this wrong and you look like an idiot because you listened to me. Like we said, it's some combination of incompetence, of arrogance, of hubris, and a lack of humility after things are proven wrong. It's really concerning and damaging, I think, to public health's reputation.
Do you ever run into people who say, you're obsessing over this, it's years later now, time to move on?
Yeah, a little bit. You know, look, to some extent, I agree. I think that a lot of the public has moved on. Thank God. It's overjoyed and thrilled that we have finally moved forward past this, hopefully permanently. But I think it's important to point out that these mistakes, there's a systemic problem here. It's not just about COVID. It's about the fact that people in these positions of power are making decisions based off of poor information. There's no willingness to kind of engage in humility or to question their own belief systems. And, you know, I think a great example, the opposite of that, is someone like Ron DeSantis in Florida, who initially, though he was never strict lockdowns and like Cuomo or Newsom or anything like that, but initially I think he was a little bit more willing to trust what the experts were saying. And very quickly, because he's an incredibly smart man who listens to people around, you know, smart people around him, got some new information, started looking at the data, started looking at the evidence, and said, this is garbage. They don't know what they're talking about. And he started to immediately unwind the small measures that he had done. That's what you want to see, right? Not everybody's going to be right. But when you get new information that shows that the measures are wrong, you got to start pulling back or change course. And he was willing to do that. That takes a great deal of intelligence and courage and humility. And the fact that experts almost universally are the opposite of that, I think is really damaging, because it's not just about COVID. It's going to be in other policies too and other mandates too. And the danger of allowing them to kind of go on unchecked is like, well, they have the degree. We can't question them. That shouldn't be allowed. I think that's the point of continuing to have these discussions after these mandates have lifted.
American television. It's on another network, so I'm not allowed to tell you the name of that network. But it's not a hard discovery to make. Because it's on the Discovery Channel. There. Uh-oh, they're going to fire me. You did it. Get out. Anyway, that was me. You see why I gave up the acting? Can you do crying? That just looks like you've eaten something. Anyway, tonight on Shark Week, I'm very excited. Tonight on Shark Week, a nurse shark, dangerous shark, a nurse shark attacks a whole school of fish. Nothing compared to what was on CBS, of course. Tonight on CBS, 2.5 Men, Charlie Sheen attacks a whole school of nurses. I can't believe that people just do that just to scare you. What's in it for a news organization to scare you? What's in it for them? How does it turn into money?
I'll tell you exactly how it turns into money. You know, 100 years ago, the town crier would go down the street and say, 11 o'clock and all's well. And the town crier of today, the local news, goes down the street and says, 11 o'clock and mother's milk causes cancer in children. Right. Anything to get our attention. What happens, to answer your question, is nothing gets our attention like fear. Right. You can't hear, next up, an expert tells about the dangers of dust to your children. Vacuum cleaners can kill your children, and not, you think, oh, shit, I gotta watch that now.
Right, of course, you have to.
And next up, turkey that killed 4 on Thanksgiving. I gotta watch about the turkeys. Yeah. And so it's, the only one you never hear is, next up, a new study that says television news causes stress, suicide, drug addiction, and hypertension.
Right.
All true,
I'm gonna tell you that.
Before that, the United States had deployed missiles and launchers to Poland and Romania. Those are, and this was an issue that Putin raised in December of 2021 with the United States, with Joe Biden directly, that they viewed those as another existential threat to Russia, because those missiles from those launchers, which could carry nuclear warheads, can be in Moscow in 10 minutes. It is in a way sort of the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. So the United States has put those there, and I think that is really the underlying issue behind this entire special military operation. Russia's going to create a buffer, but at the end, there's going to be a confrontation with the United States. Those missile systems must be removed from Romania or Poland, or Russia will remove them. What we have seen is a complete transformation of the CIA into a political animal. I mean, you just had proof, testimony from one of the people that signed the letter claiming Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation, that they were personally contacted by the CIA to sign such a letter. Think of that. This was not just former CIA officials doing this. This was the actual CIA personnel in the pre-publication office reaching out, encouraging these people to engage in lie and interfering in an election.
You are a former agent, officer, analyst for the CIA. You know the CIA charter. You know the prohibitions on being involved in law enforcement or surveillance or politics within the United States. Can you assure me that all of your colleagues know that, and many of them don't give a damn?
Yeah. Oh, they know it, but they're not following it. And this stems from the leadership at the top. That's where this comes from. When I went into the agency, I was considered a conservative. I was a Reagan voter, and yet I saw my job as having to tell an objective truth without regard to the political control in Washington at the time. In fact, I became accused of being anti-Reagan because my analysis did not flow, was not consistent with what the policy was being announced out of the Reagan White House at the time.
The recognition of individual rights implies the recognition of the fact that the good is not an ineffable abstraction in some supernatural dimension, but a value pertaining to reality, to this earth, to the lives of individual human beings. Note the right to the pursuit of happiness. It implies that the good cannot be divorced from beneficiaries, that men are not to be regarded as interchangeable, and that no man or tribe may attempt to achieve the good of some at the price of the immolation of others.
And the reason he's doing that is hoping to buy actual investments in the future at a better price than he could buy those investments today. I think it would be better for Berkshire shareholders if he did that using gold, not dollars. And maybe at some point he's going to start doing that, because he doesn't dislike gold as an alternative to the dollar. He just dislikes it as an alternative to stocks. dividend paying stocks. And over the long run, he's right. Over long periods of time, if you're a smart investor and you buy good businesses cheap and collect dividends, you will do better than just holding gold in a vault. But over short periods of time, you may do better holding gold, depending on stock valuations, where you are in the business cycle, what's going on with inflation. And I think Buffett might figure that out. But one of the things I was laughing because I was watching on CNBC, and all of the Bitcoin shills that work there were talking about Warren Buffett, and they're making fun of him because he's still negative on Bitcoin. And they're saying, he says all these crazy things about Bitcoin. No, he doesn't say anything crazy about Bitcoin. Everything he says about Bitcoin is perfectly sane. But these guys are dismissing him. They're entertainers. They're journalists, right? I mean, this guy is supposedly the oracle. He's one of the most successful investors in U.S. history, and these guys are just a bunch of reporters who are, / entertainers, and they think that this guy has nothing valuable to say. Danger of losing that because he doesn't see any other currency that is positioned to take the dollar's place. And again, on that, I agree with Warren Buffett. I don't think that any currency should replace the dollar as the reserve currency. But the problem with Warren Buffett's vision is he's looking in the wrong place. He's looking for other currencies and seeing, well, there's problems with the euro, there's problems with the yen, problems with the RMB, and so the dollar is safe because these other fiat currencies, they've got problems of their own. Well, he should look beyond fiat currencies, again, to real money. The alternative that Warren Buffett fails to recognize is gold. Gold is the alternative. And in fact, look at the numbers. Central banks are now buying gold at a record pace. That information just came out. But despite the fact that central banks are buying gold at a record pace, they still don't own nearly as much as they have in the past. They have a lot of gold to buy to catch up to where they need to be, which is much, much higher than they are right now. So the world is already in the process of replacing US dollars with gold. And the dollar did not replace another fiat currency. It replaced gold. Prior to Bretton Woods, all the currencies were backed by gold. Not another fiat currency, gold. And when the United States was able to convince the world to adopt the dollar standard, it was because the dollar was not only backed by gold, but convertible on demand into gold. $35 got you an ounce of gold. And then Nixon defaulted in 1971, right? All this talk about how the U.S. government has never defaulted. We defaulted on our promise to pay gold. Federal Reserve notes were notes. They were obligations of the U.S. government or the Fed to pay gold. We defaulted and paid nothing. So when you're supposed to pay something and you pay nothing, it's a default. So we defaulted in 1971. It's been over 50 years. And now I think the world is going to reject fiat dollars. We told the world that you have to have dollars without gold. And now the world is going to tell us, well, we don't want your dollars anymore. We're going back to gold. And so Warren Buffett doesn't see that. And a lot of people are missing that alternative. They just assume that the dollar is safe because the euro or the yen are no good. And they're overlooking what's obvious, and that is gold. That the president and his family committed crimes, and particularly Joe Biden, because he was the vice president. He's the one that took an oath. He's the one that peddled his influence, not even to Americans, but to foreigners, to foreign interests. He basically accepted over $10 million in bribes, which is basically what this was, over the 8 years he was vice president. And the way he was able to launder all of this criminal money, because this is a crime, earning money this way. When you're the vice president and you are selling influence, you are using your authority for the advantage of people who have paid you money, directly paid you money to do something, and then you do something in exchange for that bribe, that is illegal. And then when you try to disguise the illegal nature of that money through complicated structures, you are laundering that money. You are committing multiple crimes. And I think the Republicans have already made a very compelling case that you don't need to be Perry Mason to get a conviction of Joe Biden. After he was elected president, the Republicans reported that the Biden family created 16 shell companies, all these LLCs with different names, but not a single legitimate business purpose for any of these companies. I mean, first of all, why do they need 16 companies, right? And now these 16 companies with no legitimate business purpose, no operation, no product, no service, they all start getting paid over $10 million. And who knows, maybe it's a lot more than 10 million. I don't know. I said over 10 million. And all the money is coming from foreign entities, right? China or other countries are paying all this money to these shell companies. And then the shell companies start moving the money around without any purpose among each other, right? Money goes from one to the other. And then ultimately it gets distributed to Joe Biden's family, just his family. 9 different family members received money from these 16 shell companies. You got his brother that got money, his daughter-in-law, his wife, even his ex-wife got in on the action. His grandkids were getting money. Nieces and nephews were getting money. What were they doing? They weren't doing anything. The only person who was probably doing something was the big guy, Joe Biden. Maybe to a lesser extent, his son, Hunter, maybe was able to throw a little weight around Washington, D.C. because everybody knew, that he was the big guy's son. And so maybe, he could lean on people in place of his dad. But without his dad, he didn't have any muscle. But I'm sure that Joe Biden was delivering because these payments would not have continued for 8 years. I mean, he's getting all this money. People are paying him on multiple occasions. Obviously, they're getting something for their money. They're not just, giving all this money to the Bidens, because they like them. Obviously, they're paying for something. They're not fools. They're not going to give over $10 million and get nothing in return.
The free market represents the social application of an objective theory of values. Since values are to be discovered by man's mind, man must be free to discover them, to think, to study, to translate their knowledge into physical form, to offer their products for trade, to judge them, and to choose, be it a material good or an idea, a loaf of bread or a philosophical treatise. Since values are established contextually, every man must judge for himself in the context of his own knowledge, goals, and interests. Since values are determined by the nature of reality, it is reality that serves as man's ultimate arbiter. If a man's judgment is right, the rewards are his. If it is wrong, he is his only victim. It is in regard to a free market that the distinction between an intrinsic subjective and objective view of values is particularly important to understand. The market value of a product is not an intrinsic value, not a value in itself hanging in a vacuum. A free market never loses sight of the question of value to whom. And within the broad field of objectivity, the market value of a product does not reflect its philosophically objective value, but only its socially objective value. By philosophically objective, I mean a value estimated from the standpoint of the best possible to man. That is, by the criterion of the most rational mind possessing the greatest knowledge in a given category, in a given period, and in a defined context. Nothing can be estimated in an undefined context. For instance, it can be rationally proved that the airplane is objectively of immeasurably greater value to man at his best, than the bicycle, and that the works of Victor Hugo are objectively of immeasurably greater value than True Confession magazines. But if a given man's intellectual potential can barely manage to enjoy True Confessions, there is no reason why his meager earnings, the product of his effort, should be spent on books he cannot read, or on subsidizing the airplane industry if his own transportation needs do not extend beyond the range of a bicycle. Nor is there any reason why the rest of mankind should be held down to the level of his literary taste, his engineering capacity, and his income. Values are not determined by fiat nor by majority rule. Just as the number of its adherents is not a proof of an idea's truth or falsehood, of an artwork's merit or demerit, of a product's efficacy or inefficacy. So the free market value of goods or services does not necessarily represent their philosophically objective value, but only their socially objective value. That is, the sum of the individual judgments of all the men involved in trade at a given time, the sum of what they valued, each in the context of his own life.
This is, I think, a pretty triumphant moment for Trump, and this shows how well prepared he was. Now, this is not I didn't use the audio clip, but just the main point, because Caitlin Collins says to Trump, why did it take you 3 hours to tell those rioters to go home on January 6th? And what he did was amazing. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a printout of his tweets. And he said, I don't believe I did. Checks his notes. On January 5th, the day before, I said, please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They're on the side of our country. Stay peaceful. And then he went on to say, as I was giving my speech, as they were there, I told them to be peaceful, and peacefully protest. So he basically destroyed her whole thesis of her question, which is that it took him 3 hours to tell people to go home.
Yeah, so
I thought that was pretty strong.
He definitely was and got back on him. But I found also an interesting thing, because it's not a yes and a no, and that is, would you what would you do if you're president? Would you pardon the people?
Yeah, that was good.
And so I guess they were expecting him to blunt out, yeah, they're all going to get pardoned. Yeah. But his answer was very dignified in that he would study it, and the people who did not commit, acts of violence, yes, and that would be a lot of them. Yeah. But how they've been treated? Just think that how they've been imprisoned without due process of law, and they're still there suffering from it. The families have suffered, but it doesn't seem like the civil liberties of the Trump opponents really care too much about that. So it would be, and I believe he would follow up on that promise. I think if he becomes president, he's going to sit down and look at it and have somebody say, well, these 10 or 15 people went over the top, and that's it. And but to do this for years, going on now, so that whole thing is a tragedy, because they always wanted to say that this was a part of a insurrection.
Yeah.
This was bad stuff. It was insurrection. And then once again, there was a policeman shot a demonstrator. A policeman. Yeah, the Capitol Hill policeman shot a woman. Yeah. Was she getting ready? Did she have a gun? Was she pointing a gun? What was she doing? Oh, they found out afterwards she didn't have a gun. And but he said he was frightened about it. It looked like there could be danger ahead. But they investigated it. The Capitol Hill Police and the other organization. They said no. He had a right to be frightened about that. So he just fires and kills somebody like that.
The whole 45 seconds of this one.
Absolutely. Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I don't think in terms of winning and losing. I think in terms of getting it settled, so we stop killing all these people and breaking down.
Good.
On that, you said you don't think in terms of winning and losing. Mr. President, can I just follow up on that, because that's a really important statement that you just made there. Can you say if you want Ukraine or Russia to win this war?
I want everybody to stop dying. They're dying, Russians and Ukrainians. I want them to stop dying, and I'll have that done. I'll have that done in 24 hours. I'll have it done. You need the power of the presidency to do it.
But you won't say that you want Ukraine to win.
You know what I'll say? I'll say this.
So we have her, and this is really a critique of the entire way that the news media handles these events, treating it like a sporting event. Which team are you on? Do you want Ukraine to win or do you want Russia to win? And again, Trump didn't fall for it. He said, I don't look at it that way. I look at it as people are dying, and I want to stop them dying, and I want to do whatever it takes to help them stop dying. And she couldn't let up with this, because she wanted him to say, well, I'm for Putin, I'm Putin's puppet, which he didn't say. He said, I want to end this war. And I think you can see from the reaction of the audience, they appreciated that more nuanced approach.
Thus, a manufacturer of lipstick may well make a greater fortune than a manufacturer of microscopes, even though it can be rationally demonstrated that microscopes are scientifically more valuable than lipstick. But valuable to whom? A microscope is of no value to a little stenographer struggling to make a living. A lipstick to her may mean the difference between self-confidence and self-doubt, between glamour and drudgery. This does not mean, however, that the values ruling a free market are subjective. If the stenographer spends all her money on cosmetics and has none left to pay for the use of a microscope for a visit to the doctor when she needs it. She learns a better method of budgeting her income. The free market serves as her teacher. She has no way to penalize others for her mistakes. If she budgets rationally, the microscope is always available to serve her own specific needs and no more as far as she is concerned. She is not taxed to support an entire hospital, a research laboratory, or a spaceship's journey to the moon. Within her own productive power, she does pay a part of the cost of scientific achievements when and as she needs them. She has no social duty. Her own life is her only responsibility, and the only thing that the capitalist system requires of her is the thing that nature requires, rationality. That is, that she live and act to the best of her own judgment.
Deal. And it's a lot of also
bullshit. Absolute bullshit. That is bullshit.
Yep, because it's the Repulsivkins, and you know I can't stand the Repulsivkins or the Democrats. They're all shit to me. They're the ones that when they get in power, when the Democrats are in the president, they always make a big deal about raising the debt level. But when Trump was in, it was okay. But now with Biden in, you got a majority, a small majority in the House that are Republicans. We got to do something with this debt level, which is disgusting, by the way. We shouldn't have this. $31.4 trillion. $31.4 trillion. How are we going to pay it? We're not. Which goes back to why gold is golden to me. And we have no advertisers. I don't give financial advice. But I'm showing you what's going on with this debt crisis. And if that happens, you're going to see the markets crash. You're going to see the economy go down, jobs lost in the 8 to 10 million range, and the markets crash, economy crashes. So this is a power play. That's all it is. It's just a power play. So again, though, interest rates are high and the commercial sector is going to be dying. The foot traffic in New York City right now is 25% lower than what it was. Retailers leave cities for suburbs. Yeah. Again, the office building bust is real. And this is a lot of also, leaving for the suburbs. Some of you are getting more business. How much more? Data from the Bank of America Institute yesterday revealed households making more than $125,000 have seen wage growth slow down faster than lower income households. And the Bank of America says that because the highest earning 40% of households by income account for more than 60% of consumer spending. 40% contribute to 60%. And they're losing their jobs. You go to your Trends Journal. So on the market front, the Dow was down today over 200 points, 221 points. And the S&P declined a bit. And the NASDAQ was up a bit. So investors worry over regional banks. Yeah, they once again flared up. Yeah, that PacWest lost 22%. No, wait a minute. Jamie Dimon says it's over. There's nothing to worry about. Everything is cool. And they had the producer price indexes came out. The number increased just 0.2%. And that's pretty, that's not much. And so it's coming down. There's no question about it. Inflation is easing to some extent. So now, will the Federal Reserve pause their interest rates when they meet in mid-June? That's the guess on the street, and we're going to tell you where it's going. But Eurozone inflation rising. Yep, surged to 7% in April. 7%. Consumer prices rose 6.9% in March. So you see where it's going and how it's hurting the people. We're mentioning this because they also raised interest rates over there in the EU. It's still low compared to inflation, but they're way higher than the negative that they used to have. So the higher interest rates go, the deeper the economy falls. UK food prices skyrocketed. British households have been hit with a record jump in food prices. 17.8% increase in April. But don't worry about it, because the UK is doing all they can to help win the Ukraine war. So all you people of slave land in the UK, don't you worry about it. We got wars to fight, money to steal, so take it easy. And what no one anywhere is talking about, other than us, is all of this inflation and all of these problems have been caused by the low-life pieces of scum shit political pricks, and I can't say the other word, that locked down the world. Oh, and then you had those supply chain disruptions. That's why you got this inflation, and the economy's going down as they raise interest rates to stop the phony COVID war that they started. And to win it, they had to pump in countless trillions of dollars and negative and zero interest rate policy. But don't worry, people. Do as you're told. Don't think for yourself. Be a little parrot and follow what they tell you to do, like all the shitheads up here in Kingston, New York, and everywhere else, all around towns. No vaccine card. You can't come in. You can't buy a cup of coffee. You can't go to a restaurant. You can't go listen to music. No vaccine passport. You can't get in. You can't get in. Yes, sir. Yes, master. I do whatever you tell me to do.
I sit down with Big Brother in the good old USA. I got the blues about my freedom. Got the blues about you and me. I got the blues about my freedom. Got the blues about tyranny. I sit down with Big Brother, no more slavery. Well, you can talk to me. sit down with Big Brother. No more slavery. How about this? Everybody help me out. I sit down with Big Brother. Down with Big Brother. Down with Big Brother. Shame on Big It's all about liberty.
War.com today, the UK confirms that they are sending long-range missiles to Ukraine. So British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace confirmed on Thursday that London is providing Ukraine with longer-range missiles, marking another escalation of NATO support for Kiev. The provision of longer-range weapons to Ukraine risks a major escalation as they can be used to target Russian territory. Ukrainian officials have insisted that they would not use them for attacks inside Russia, but leaked Pentagon documents have indicated that Zelensky would want to. There was a document about a conversation he had saying that he wasn't happy that they didn't have missiles that could hit Russian troops inside Russian territory. And, you know, when it comes to Crimea, Ukraine and its Western backers do not recognize Crimea as Russian territory, which means targeting that peninsula is not off limits with these weapons. And attacks on Crimea can be just as escalatory as even Secretary of State Antony Blinken has acknowledged that the peninsula is a red line for Vladimir Putin. So the Kremlin called the news extremely negative and vowed to respond. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "This will demand an adequate response from our military, which will naturally, from a military point of view, find corresponding solutions," end quote. If you remember, you know, the British recently sent depleted uranium ammunition to Ukraine, and Putin responded to that by announcing that he's going to send nukes to Belarus. So that was a pretty big response to that. U.S. officials have welcomed the British move, but have said that it will not mean the U.S. is going to be providing Ukraine with the Army tactical missile systems, the ATACMS. Ukraine has been asking for those missiles for a while now. They have a range of up to 190 miles, and they can be fired by the HIMARS rocket system.
Within every category of goods and services offered on a free market, it is the purveyor of the best product at the cheapest price who wins the greatest financial rewards in that field. Not automatically, nor immediately, nor by fiat, but by virtue of the free market, which teaches every participant to look for the objective best within the category of his own competence, and penalizes those who act on irrational considerations. Now observe that a free market does not level men down to some common denominator, that the intellectual criteria of the majority do not rule a free market or a free society, and that the exceptional men, the innovators, the intellectual giants, are not held down by the majority. In fact, it is the members of this exceptional minority who lift the whole of a free society to the level of their own achievements, while rising further and ever further.
The many common theories that maybe a homeschool mom, a conservative homeschool mom, might perceive about the world that the rest of the kind of polished candidates for sheriff would not. And she'd kind of put them to shame. She'd embarrass them the way she spoke. So there's a law that's been in place in California since the 80s that unless you are law enforcement, you're not allowed to run for sheriff. Sheriff is you can argue it's the most important elected position in any county because it has so much authority. And it happened because such a popular sheriff won in the 80s in San Francisco. And law enforcement said, you know what? The doctors union, they make sure that only their people are able to practice medicine. The lawyers union make sure only their people are allowed to practice law. Why isn't the law enforcement union making sure only our people can be allowed to practice as a sheriff? And that's effectively what they did. Of course, the sheriff is an elected position, different than doctor, different than an attorney. So On's being treated as a test case where this law really shouldn't stand. Really, anyone should be able to run for sheriff, but she's being treated as a test case here. And the DA wants to make sure that's upheld, especially in Silicon Valley. They like how things are. They like how it's being run, who's in charge. And these conservative homeschool moms that have shown up and think they're going to have a voice now, they're not allowed to do that. And I'm very sad to see people like this be arrested. Or another gentleman in December 2020 arrested for not wearing a face mask in a UPS store in Hollister, California, Red County, just outside the Bay Area. The establishment is starting to realize that the health freedom folks are not going to go away, and they can't be dealt with in the gentle way they've been dealt with. And these same folks, like I said, who weren't involved in politics previously, after these few years, they're starting to become savvy on how to impact things. And I think the establishment is saying we need to deal more harshly with them. I just got off the phone before we got on. I got off the phone with a loved one who has a cold or something and turned into TV for brains as a result. And I hear you. I hear you. There's been this very sophisticated brainwashing operation. This $1 trillion media machine has acted against the American people for 3 years very effectively, and for 20 years before that, and for 50 years before that, and in increasing waves. I have this analogy that has been very helpful to me, that in all periods of time, there have been these kind of sinister folks who have sought to take advantage of others, these hyena-type people. And there's these Klaus Schwabs, Bill Gates, Joe Bidens, fill in the blank with your sinister individual. And if you spend too much time reflecting on them, focusing on them, you're going to leave yourself kind of bummed out. And they don't deserve unlimited attention. That you should be aware of what they're up to, but they don't deserve unlimited attention. And there's a second group, that hyena group, they don't determine the trajectory of history. There's a second group that is the majority throughout history, and they get pejoratively referred to as sheep, but they are kind of sheep-like. And I don't mean to say that in a pejorative way, that they simply look for kind of the safe route. They try to figure out who the best leader is. They just try to kind of get through the day as easily as possible with as little conflict as possible. And this group, this sheep-like group, if you spend too much time thinking about the triple masked neighbor, the aunt, the uncle, the whoever who has had 8 vaccines, you're going to bum yourself out spending too much time thinking about them. But there's this third group, and I believe they deserve the attention. They determine the trajectory of history. And it's this lion group. If they are awake or asleep, it has a great deal on how history plays out. It has a great deal of impact on it. And I think with your show that this is kind of I know you certainly spend some time encouraging some sheep-like people, but I think overwhelmingly you cater to the lion-like types, helping to wake them up, helping to make them aware of what's going on in the world. And I think you pay attention to those lion-like people, help to wake them up, and you don't have to give them a top-down organization. You don't have to say, let's rally 51% of the population, it's going to work. You just got to wake them up, and they're going to walk through the world being their free selves. And you might not like everything they do when they're free, but that's what they're going to do. And they're going to exude freedom everywhere they walk, everywhere they exist. You do. We talked about what I'm willing to stay through. I don't know exactly, but I know that I'm not willing to leave right now. It needs to be fought this fight. What will you be willing to not go somewhere else for? When is a line where you will say, no chance I'm leaving, I'm fighting right now? Well, I'm not leaving the United States. Okay. Because this is where I live, and because I feel like I shouldn't be the one who has to leave, and because there are vastly worse places in the world, especially on COVID, vastly worse. I have a federal system here where the winds can change. Florida was not as clearly red 4 or 5 years ago as it is today. So sometimes it can be the case that it's better for me to live in a different part of the United States, but I can always find in some corner of it a critical mass of people with at least remotely sensible ideas. And I can't say that for Sweden. Sweden's a wonderful place. Stockholm's a beautiful city. But okay, on COVID, they were good, I'll grant you. But on a lot of issues, it's just hopeless. Whereas at least in the US, there are concentrations of people who have sensible ideas. But I'm too much of a homebody. I always feel like a fish out of water when I'm in another country. I love visiting, but after about a week or so, I feel like I got to get back and eat familiar food and talk to native English speakers, and so I can be more clearly understood. So it would take a lot more for me to think the United States itself has to be abandoned, because I have a greater attachment to it than I have to any one particular state. That makes a lot of sense. I'm totally with you. As attractive as some things are about other countries, it's just not. America's the last stronghold as far as I'm concerned.
A free market is a continuous process that cannot be held still, an upward process that demands the best, the most rational, of every man and rewards him accordingly. While the majority have barely assimilated the value of the automobile, the creative minority introduces the airplane. The majority learn by demonstration. The minority is free to demonstrate. The philosophically objective value of a new product serves as the teacher for those who are willing to exercise their rational faculty, each to the extent of his ability. Those who are unwilling remain unrewarded, as well as those who aspire to more than their ability produces. The stagnant, the irrational, the subjectivist have no power to stop their betters.
So what Will and I did was show people what was actually said and to really give you an idea of what the current rhetoric from the president of Russia is right now as far as how they view the proxy war led by Washington against them, which is what he discussed. So we write that President Vladimir Putin declared that all of Russia is united in support of its troops, claiming they face a real war intended to destroy their country during his annual Victory Day speech in Moscow's Red Square on Tuesday. Celebrated on May 9th in Russia, Victory Day is the country's yearly commemoration to honor the Soviet troops who defeated the forces of Nazi Germany during World War II. The ceremonies and military parade were notably pared back relative to previous years. However, as Russia's war in Ukraine grinds into its 15th month. So Putin said, today our civilization is at a crucial turning point. A real war is being waged against our country again. But we have countered international terrorism and we will defend the people of the Donbass and safeguard our security. The Russian leader declaimed that Moscow seeks peace and stability while railing against American exceptionalism and the, quote, Western globalist elites. He said these forces pit countries against one another with coup plots and proxy conflicts, such as the 2014 U.S.-backed coup in Kiev and Ukraine's subsequent war on Russian-speaking separatists in the eastern Donbass region, which was supported by Washington, of course. Now, these actions preceded Putin's invasion, and the president has repeatedly cited the need to, quote, defend the people of the Donbass as justification for his so-called special military operation. And Putin went on to say, for us, for Russia, there are no unfriendly or hostile nations either in the West or in the East. Just like the vast majority of people on the planet, we want to see a peaceful, free, and stable future, Putin claimed. Russians believe that any ideology of superiority is abhorrent, criminal, and deadly by its nature. However, the Western globalist elites, speaking about their exceptionalism, pit nations against each other and split societies, provoke bloody conflicts and coups, sow hatred, Russophobia, aggressive nationalism, destroy family and traditional values which make us human. They do all that so as to keep dictating and imposing their will, their rights, and rules on people, which in reality is a system of plundering, violence, and suppression. The Russian leader went on to claim that the war in Ukraine is a defensive action against a collective West which seeks to subvert and balkanize Russia, ultimately hoping to wipe the country off the map. He said their goal, and there is nothing new about it, is to break apart and destroy our country, to make null and void the outcomes of World War II, to completely break down the system of global security and international law, to choke off any sovereign centers of development. Putin blamed the same forces for provoking the disaster in Ukraine and NATO's ongoing proxy war against Russia, pointing to massive casualties resulting from callous and self-serving Western policies. He said boundless ambition, arrogance, and impunity inevitably lead to tragedies. This is the reason for the catastrophe the Ukrainian people are going through. They have become hostage to the coup d'etat and the resulting criminal regime of its Western masters, collateral damage in the implementation of their cruel and self-serving plans. Putin also hailed the emergence of the new multipolar world, saying that an unstoppable movement is gaining momentum towards a world based on principles of trust and indivisible security, of equal opportunities for a genuine and free development of all nations and peoples. He praised the Russian forces fighting in Ukraine as heroes, saying they're up against a West which has, quote, forgotten what the Nazis' insane claims of global dominance led to. They forgot who destroyed that monstrous total evil, who stood up for their native land and did not spare their lives to liberate the peoples of Europe. And he also went on to in that same sort of vein, to discuss the fact he accused of certain elements in this Western globalist elite that he's referring to, that they've constructed essentially a cult of Nazis, and that they've deployed neo-Nazi scum to attack Russia and to attack ethnic Russians in the Donbass, of course, which is, there's some truth to that, definitely. With, of course, ever since Trump, we've been arming a government which has Nazis like the Azov Battalion literally absorbed into their National Guard. And these are some of the fiercest fighters within the Ukrainian armed forces, or at least they were. I mean, I'm not exactly sure how many of them still are around after more than a year of the war, but the important thing is that what he was talking about was, as well as the attacks on Russian culture throughout Eastern Europe, in places like Poland and Ukraine, that taking down all of the Russian monuments. And, we just saw in Latvia, Reuters was reporting that Russian speakers are having to take tests in Latvian to prove the Latvian language and for Ukraine. And also, of course, Blinken and Cleverly coming out and saying that they will essentially keep this war, which they've already admitted is designed to bleed Russia dry and to weaken them in perpetuity, really regardless of the casualties on the Ukrainian side. And of course, Putin's pinning all that on the Americans, which isn't fair because he's bombing civilians and civilian infrastructure and doing all kinds of criminal things, committing war crimes. But of course, all of that blood is just as much as it's on Putin's hands. It's absolutely all over the Joe Biden administration, the Donald Trump administration, the Barack Obama administration, our Congress, George W. Bush, for getting this whole ball rolling, really, the Clintons. And so, the Americans are just as responsible for all of this. But anyway, so on Tuesday, when the bombs started dropping, Ben Gvir tweeted, "It's about time." According to the Times of Israel, as y'all might expect, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on Thursday said that Iran has amassed enough fissile material for 5 nuclear bombs, warning the Islamic Republic against further enriching uranium toward weapons-grade levels. So as usual, as they're bombing the Gazans and committing horrible war crimes, which is pretty much what Israel does, the world's most notorious apartheid state, they always have to point their finger at Iran to distract attention from that, which the U.S. media and all the Israeli firsters in the government and the press, and they're all going to follow suit. Unfortunately, it's absolutely devastating.
The small minority of adults who are unable, rather than unwilling to work, have to rely on voluntary charity. Misfortune is not a claim to slave labor. There is no such thing as the right to consume, control, and destroy those without whom one would not be able to survive. As to depressions and mass unemployment, they are not caused by the free market, but by government interference into the economy.
It's bad. Right off the bat, chair of World Economic Forum's task force on the future of work. I mean, that's as bad as it gets, World Economic Forum. Even Elon Musk has tweeted that the WEF is increasingly becoming an unelected world government that people never asked for and don't want. So even Elon Musk knows about the WEF. She comes from NBC Universal, mainstream media, so she comes with all the stuff that comes with the mainstream media, all this social justice stuff, all the leftism. She pushed ad campaigns for the vax with the Pope, using the Pope as, for advertising the vaccine. And, personnel is policy. That's the way it is. And we just went through the Trump administration, which was one of the most ironic things. Here is a TV star of a show called The Apprentice, where he was hiring and firing people. And as president, he hired the worst people imaginable to be in his administration, people that worked actively against him. The president would go on TV and say something. I remember specifically a video. He's bringing the troops home from Syria, a wonderful video. And then someone comes out, oh, no, we're not doing that. He didn't mean that. So who you hire it's everything. So Elon Musk, this is a very big contradiction to what he has done up to this point, and it makes you wonder what's going on. Say everything is fine for a while. No, she doesn't rock the boat at first. More big names, Tucker Carlson went to Twitter, other ones, they think it's safe to go to Twitter, and everything's fine for a while. And they say, see, you're all worried about nothing. Okay, well, what if something significant happens, like a major war or election shenanigans? What happens then? Do things start to change at Twitter? Will people start being censored again? You need someone, and you have to assure the public, especially people are paying money for Twitter now. You have to assure them that you're going to hire somebody that will not bend, whether there's a war, whether there's election, stuff going on again. And how can you, when you look at, what she has done so far, think that she will not bend? I hate to put him on the spot, but if Ron Paul was CEO, you could be comfortable. He's not going to bend on the First Amendment. And if the truth needs to get out somewhere on Twitter, he would, you'd be comfortable. How can you be comfortable? I don't understand what Elon Musk is doing.
I think the big issue here is, so often is, it's the issue of the First Amendment. Of course, all the amendments are good. Certainly the Second is, and the Fourth, and they're all good. But if you lose the First Amendment, you really lose your right of free expression. The one thing I've noticed over the years when there's political opposition, especially now with the harsh rhetoric that goes on between the two parties, is that the opposition to those of us who might be promoting in a sincere manner the free market and private property and non-interventionist foreign policy, real civil liberties. The opposition, if they think you're gaining ground, they will use our language. Their arguments will be, freedom. That is what they have done for years. They just try to deceive. But the real issue is the issue of freedom of speech. And Chris just mentioned the fact, what's it going to be like in 5 years from now or 2 years from now? Because once you invite them in there and people are supporting it, then it's hard to back out and say, well, no, I have to disagree with that. But they use the terminology that people want to hear, and when they hear it, they say, oh, those progressive Democrats, we've heard a lot of bad things about them, but they're not so bad. But just listen to them now in the campaign; they're not quite so bad. They try that. what we're hoping for is that the people are awake enough now that at least the rhetoric on COVID no longer sells very much, and it's being sold with more difficulty when it comes to Ukraine and the need to send more money to Ukraine and look for another fight and sending our navies in there to pester China and all these things that makes no sense at all. But it's all for national security interest, to protect our liberties, protect our Constitution, and people want to hear that. But the big thing is sorting it out, and it's not always that easy. And this one has just put some red flags up. This incidence of what Musk is doing in his hiring practices. So let's hope we're able to keep tabs of this and keep reporting on what's going on and what it means. But right now there's a lot of unknowns. Chris.
Very good, Dr. Paul. I'll finish up with my final statement. One thing, those who watch us and listen to us regularly, that you'll find on the Ron Paul Liberty Report is consistency. Whether it be war and non-interventionism, you're going to get a consistent point of view on that. Sound the money in the Fed, same thing. Voluntarism, and if you've listened to Dr. Paul since the 1970s, or even go back, they're all on YouTube, 80s, 90s, you'll see it's the same message. It's not tailored to any generation, any decade. It's the same message of liberty, private property, because principles do not change. Economic laws don't change. The truth does not change, even though we live in a society that has waged complete and total war on anything that is true. Whether it be 2 + 2 can sometimes equal 5, depending on the situation, or the gender stuff. They want to mix everything up and what that does is it creates a population that, if you don't know the truth, boy, are you easy prey for people that are looking for power. They'll control you so fast and so easily because you have no anchors to anything, and you'll just follow the propaganda or whatever the group says. And that's where this individual comes from, NBC. This is all groupthink. Everyone is supposed to say and think the same exact thing. So Elon Musk, he should look for consistency. He has been so good on free speech at what he has said, what he has done. And now it looks inconsistent. It looks bad. And that really hurts the trust. And, we'll see what happens.
The mental parasites, the imitators who attempt to cater to what they think is the public's known taste, are constantly being beaten by the innovators, whose products raise the public's knowledge and taste to ever higher levels. It is in this sense that the free market is ruled not by the consumers, but by the producers. The most successful ones are those who discover new fields of production, fields which had not been known to exist. A given product may not be appreciated at once, particularly if it is too radical an innovation. But barring irrelevant accidents, it wins in the long run. It is in this sense that the free market is not ruled by the intellectual criteria of the majority, which prevail only at and for any given moment. The free market is ruled by those who are able to see and plan long range. And the better the mind, the longer the range.
This E-Verify thing is a monstrosity, and it will be truly horrible if this passes. And it's classic government shit where they cause a problem and then they try to come up with the solution, and the solution just makes everything worse. I don't know how much you've looked into this, Rob, but it's pretty freaking creepy, and it's pretty in line with like a lot of the creepy shit that the government's been doing over the last, a couple decades here. But this is basically, they're proposing a federal database where you have to prove to your employer that the federal government says you're allowed to work. Now, this isn't about immigration control any more than like the Patriot Act was just about getting Muslims or something like that. This is something that's going to be used against Americans. So everyone should oppose this. I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of that, Rob. Feel free to jump in.
Well, I've seen Thomas Massey tweeting about it quite a bit, and I've yet to see Thomas Massey be wrong on an issue or uninformed on an issue. So if there was if you only went to Twitter and followed one person, it was Thomas Massey, you'd be informed on some of the most important things. So I haven't dug into all the particulars, but just to flag what's very creepy about it is, you just said, and I don't even know if this is technically accurate, it might just be a summation, but what does that mean, allowed to work? So I guess in this instance, the criteria is that there's going to be a digital database of everybody that might, be tied to your fingerprint, your eye scan, or some other piece of technology. But so I guess in this instance, it's to make sure that you're a legal citizen. But what if that's tied to some sort of a vaccine that you were supposed to have, or an opinion that you were stating online, or whether or not you're, I don't know, all of a sudden just some registrations overdue. What this sounds like is building digital infrastructure that's going to force you to have some sort of phone or other piece of technology that's going to know more about what your whereabouts are. And what we need to be protecting ourselves from is creating infrastructure that makes us easily controlled by government.
Yeah.
At the moment, like, I mean, we already don't have, you know what I mean? They can already, every time I'm on the road, a cop can pull me over. There's like a lot of opportunities for us to be policed. But at least at the moment, it's not some digital infrastructure where they just get to type in, hey, this guy doesn't get to leave his house, or this guy needs to go get that vaccine. Like, at least like there's still some freedom because we haven't just handed them the keys to control us. If we give them the keys to just have a digital infrastructure where they get to just run some algorithms and decide who gets to do what, have some credit scores or otherwise, don't think they won't use it. Of course they will. So we gotta forecast, we gotta educate people and do whatever we can to be like, don't give them the keys to have a digital infrastructure of knowing where your whereabouts are and having more easily ability to police your behavior. It's not a win.
The economic value of a man's work is determined on a free market by a single principle, by the voluntary consent of those who are willing to trade him their work or products in return. This is the moral meaning of the law of supply and demand. It represents the total rejection of two vicious doctrines, the tribal premise and altruism. It represents the recognition of the fact that man is not the property nor the servant of the tribe, that a man works in order to support his own life, as by his nature he must, that he has to be guided by his own rational self-interest, and if he wants to trade with others, he cannot expect sacrificial victims. That is, he cannot expect to receive values without trading commensurate values in return. The sole criterion of what is commensurate in this context is the free, voluntary, uncoerced judgment of the traders. The magnificent progress achieved by capitalism in a brief span of time, the spectacular improvement in the conditions of man's existence on Earth, is a matter of historical record. It is not to be hidden, evaded, or explained away by all the propaganda of capitalism's enemies. But what needs special emphasis is the fact that this progress was achieved by non-sacrificial means. Progress cannot be achieved by forced privations, by squeezing a so-called social surplus out of starving victims. Progress can come only out of individual surplus, that is, from the work, the energy, the creative overabundance of those men whose ability produces more than their personal consumption requires, those who are intellectually and financially able to seek the new, to improve on the known, to move forward. In a capitalist society where such men are free to function and to take their own risks, progress is not a matter of sacrificing to some distant future. It is part of the living present. It is the normal and natural. It is achieved as and while men live and enjoy their lives. Now consider the alternative, the tribal society, where all men throw their efforts, values, ambitions, and goals into a tribal pool or common pot, then wait hungrily at its rim while the leader of a clique of cooks stirs it with a bayonet in one hand and a blank check on all their lives in the other. The most consistent example of such a system is the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. Half a century ago, the Soviet rulers commanded their subjects to be patient, bear privations, and make sacrifices for the sake of industrializing the country, promising that this was only temporary, that industrialization would bring them abundance. and Soviet progress would surpass the capitalistic West. Today, Soviet Russia is still unable to feed her people, while the rulers scramble to copy, borrow, or steal the technological achievements of the West. Industrialization is not a static goal. It is a dynamic process with a rapid rate of obsolescence. So the wretched serfs of a planned tribal economy who starved while waiting for electric generators and tractors are now starving while waiting for atomic power and interplanetary travel. Thus, in a people's state, the progress of science is a threat to the people, and every advance is taken out of the people's shrinking hides. This was not the history of capitalism. America's abundance was not created by public sacrifices to the common good, but by the productive genius of free men who pursued their own personal interests and the making of their own private fortunes. They did not starve the people to pay for America's industrialization. They gave the people better jobs, higher wages, and cheaper goods with every new machine they invented, with every scientific discovery or technological advance. And thus the whole country was moving forward and profiting, not suffering every step of the way. Do not, however, make the error of reversing cause and effect. The good of the country was made possible precisely by the fact that it was not forced on anyone as a moral goal or duty. It was merely an effect. The cause was a man's right to pursue his own good. It is this right, not its consequences, that represents the moral justification of capitalism. But this right is incompatible with the intrinsic or the subjective theory of values, with the altruist morality and the tribal premise. It is obvious which human attribute one rejects when one rejects objectivity. And in view of capitalism's record, it is obvious against which human attribute the altruist morality and the tribal premise stand united: against man's mind, against intelligence, particularly against intelligence applied to the problems of human survival, that is, productive ability. While altruism seeks to rob intelligence of its rewards by asserting that the moral duty of the competent is to serve the incompetent and sacrifice themselves to anyone's need, the tribal premise goes a step further. It denies the existence of intelligence and of its role in the production of wealth. It is morally obscene to regard wealth as an anonymous tribal product and to talk about redistributing it. The view that wealth is the result of some undifferentiated collective process, that we all did something and it's impossible to tell who did what, therefore some sort of equalitarian distribution is necessary, might have been appropriate in the primordial jungle with a savage horde moving boulders by crude physical labor. Though even there, someone had to initiate and organize the moving. To hold that view in an industrial society where individual achievements are a matter of public record is so crass an evasion that even to give it the benefit of the doubt is an obscenity. Observe how seldom and how inadequately the issue of human intelligence is discussed in the writings of the tribal statist altruist theoreticians. Observe how carefully today's advocates of a mixed economy avoid and evade any mention of intelligence or ability in their approach to politico-economic issues, in their claims, demands, and pressure group warfare over the looting of the, quote, total social product, close quote. It is often asked, why was capitalism destroyed in spite of its incomparably beneficent record? The answer lies in the realm of philosophy. Capitalism could not survive in a culture dominated by mysticism and altruism. No social system and no human institution or activity of any kind can survive without a moral base. On the basis of the altruist morality, capitalism had to be and was damned from the start. The guiltiest men today are not the collectivists. The guiltiest men are those who, lacking the courage to challenge mysticism and altruism, attempt to bypass the issues of reason and morality, and attempt to defend the only rational and moral system in mankind's history, capitalism, on any grounds other than rational and moral. Thank you.